June 30th, 701 BC, the date appears on a fragment of clay recovered from a collapsed storage room in what was once northern Canaan. The inscription is brief, written in Proto-Hebrew script, the letters pressed hurriedly into wet clay by an inexperienced hand. A shepherd boy, perhaps 12 or 13 years old, recorded what he saw that night on the ridge above his family's encampment. The tablet reads, "Light moved, not star, not fire descending, shining like burnished metal pressed in water, they walk with us." The tablet was catalogued in 1923 by a British archaeological team working in the Tel Dan region. It sat in a museum storage facility in Manchester for 60 years before a graduate student noticed the date and the phrase. They walk with us, not it walks, not the God appears, they, plural, present tense, among us. This is not mythology, this is testimony. Across 3,000 years of written record, from the clay tablets of Mesopotamia to the papyrus scrolls of Egypt, from temple walls in Ugarit to caves carved into the cliffs above the Dead Sea, a single story repeats itself with disturbing consistency. Beings from the sky, described variously as messengers, watchers, shining ones, holy ones, descended to earth. They did not come to deliver pronouncements. They did not come to judge or to warn. They came, according to these ancient texts, for a reason that violates every boundary between heaven and earth. They fell in love with human women, and they married them. The story was systematically suppressed. Rabbinical authorities in the Second Temple period refused to include it in their sacred canon. Early Christian bishops condemned the text that contained it as heretical. Islamic scholars largely ignored it. For 2,000 years, the account of angels taking human wives was relegated to the margins of religious history. A curiosity, an embarrassment, a primitive myth that sophisticated theology had outgrown, but the text survived. In 947, in caves overlooking the Dead Sea, Bedouin shepherds discovered jars containing scrolls that had been hidden for 2 millennia. Among them were multiple copies of a book called 1 Enoch, which describes in explicit detail the descent of 200 angels who swore an oath on Mount Hermon to take human wives. Also found, fragments of the Book of Giants, an even older text detailing the offspring of these unions, children of extraordinary size and power, who became the terror of the ancient world. These were not isolated texts, they were part of a library. The community at Qumran, whoever they were, had preserved these stories deliberately, copying them multiple times, treating them as scripture. They believed this had happened. They believed the marriages between angels and humans were real events that had fundamentally altered the course of history. This documentary examines that belief. Not whether angels literally married humans. That question belongs to theology or fantasy. The question here is historical. Why did ancient Near Eastern cultures develop, preserve, and transmit stories about heavenly beings crossing an ultimate boundary to form unions with humanity? What were they trying to explain? What had they witnessed or experienced that required this explanation? And why did religious authorities across 3 major faiths work so hard to erase these stories from memory? To understand the story of angelic marriages, we must first understand the world in which that story emerged. The ancient Near East between 3500 and 1200 BCE was a landscape of radical transformation. This was the period in which human civilization first learned to preserve its thoughts in permanent form. In southern Mesopotamia, around 3200 BCE, Sumerian scribes developed cuneiform writing, wedge-shaped impressions pressed into clay tablets with a cut reed stylus. Initially used for accounting and inventory, cuneiform quickly evolved to record contracts, laws, myths, and astronomical observations. For the first time in human history, experience could outlive the experiencer. What you saw, what you thought, what frightened you, these could be written down and read by someone 3,000 years later. This was not a minor development. Writing changed what it meant to be human. It created history. Before writing, the past existed only in memory, shaped and reshaped with each telling. After writing, the past became fixed, verifiable, subject to comparison and analysis. And one of the first things ancient scribes chose to record was the sky. Mesopotamian astronomical texts from the 3rd millennium BCE meticulously document celestial phenomena. The movements of Venus, lunar eclipses, the positions of Jupiter and Saturn. But scattered among these observations are notations that don't fit standard astronomical categories. A cuneiform tablet from the reign of Amisaduqa, 1646 to 1626 BCE, describes a torch of fire that descended from the sky and moved horizontally across the plain before disappearing into the mountains. Another text from Nippur refers to shining ones who came down during a festival honouring the god Enlil. The language is careful, descriptive, unembellished. These are not poetic flights. They read like incident reports. The ancients believed the sky was populated, not empty space scattered with distant fires, but a realm inhabited by beings of power and intelligence. The Sumerian term Dingir could mean both God and bright one from above. The Akkadian Ilu carried similar connotations. Egyptian texts refer to the Neteru, divine beings who could manifest in both celestial and terrestrial forms. These were not abstract theological concepts. They were understood as real entities occupying a real place, the space above the visible dome of the sky. Cosmology in the ancient Near East was architectural. The earth was a disk floating on primordial waters, covered by a solid dome or firmament called rakia in Hebrew, bamat shamayim in Akkadian. Above the dome were the waters above, and above that the dwelling place of the gods. The dome contained windows or gates through which rain fell and through which, on rare occasions, beings from above could descend. This was not primitive ignorance. It was a working model based on observation. The sky did appear to be a solid structure, blue during the day, black at night, holding back water that occasionally fell through as rain. Lightning appeared to crack it. Stars seemed to be fixed lights embedded in it, and sometimes, witnesses claimed, beings appeared to pass through it. In Canaan, the region that would later become Israel, similar cosmological views prevailed. The Ugaritic texts from Ras Shamra, modern Syria, dating to the 14th century BCE, describe El, the high god, dwelling at the source of the two rivers, in the midst of the springs of the two deeps. This was understood as a literal location, somewhere at the cosmic periphery where heaven met the waters of chaos. Other gods and divine messengers inhabited this realm and could travel between it and earth. The Hebrew Bible preserves this three-tiered cosmology. In Genesis chapter 1, God separates the waters above from the waters below by creating the rakia, the dome. In Genesis 6, just before the flood, the text says the windows of heaven were opened, along with the fountains of the great deep. The imagery is of a controlled structure whose barriers can be breached. It is against this background that the first accounts of descending beings must be understood. The ancients did not imagine visitors from other planets in distant solar systems. They imagined beings from the realm above the dome, beings who had always been there, watching, but who under certain circumstances could descend through the gates of heaven to walk on earth. The earliest detailed accounts come from Mesopotamian sources. The Apkallu were semi-divine sages who appeared in Sumerian mythology as early as the 3rd millennium BCE. According to tradition, 7 Apkallu descended before the Great Flood to teach humanity the arts of civilization: writing, mathematics, architecture, divination, law. They were depicted as fish-cloaked humanoids or as beings with wings, often shown in relief standing beside kings or priests. The Epic of Adapa, preserved in multiple versions from the 2nd millennium BCE, tells of the first Apkallu who was brought before the god Anu in heaven after breaking the wings of the south wind. These narratives established a template. Beings from the divine realm could descend to earth, interact with humans, impart knowledge, and even transgress cosmic boundaries. The relationship was regulated but not impossible. The gods sent their agents. Humans encountered them, feared them, learned from them, and recorded the encounters. But the Apkallu were not the whole story. Mesopotamian texts also preserve accounts of unregulated contact, beings who descended without divine authorization. A fragmentary text from the Old Babylonian period refers to those who came down without permission and took for themselves wives from among the daughters of men. The language is almost identical to what would later appear in Genesis 6. What were the scribes describing? They had no concept of extraterrestrial life, no framework for understanding visitors from other worlds. What they had was a cosmology that placed powerful, intelligent beings in the realm above the sky. And they had testimony, stories, sightings, traditions, suggesting that sometimes these beings came down and didn't go back. In the Egyptian texts from the New Kingdom period, there are references to the Bay, a component of the soul that could travel between heaven and earth. The Ba was depicted with a human head and bird's body, representing its ability to cross realms. But certain texts hint at beings whose Ba remained on earth too long, who forgot the way back to the sky, and mingled with the children of dust. These scattered references, found across multiple cultures and languages, point to a widespread ancient belief. The boundary between heaven and earth was crossable. It was not meant to be crossed frequently or casually, but it could be crossed. And when it was crossed, the consequences could be profound. By the late Bronze Age, around 1200 BCE, literacy had spread throughout the Levant. Proto-Canaanite script, the ancestor of Hebrew and Phoenician alphabets, enabled wider recording of oral traditions. It is in this period that the earliest versions of what would become the biblical flood narrative likely took written form. And embedded in that narrative was a strange prologue that would haunt Jewish and Christian theology for millennia: the story of the sons of God taking the daughters of men as wives. The world before the visitors was a world that expected visitors. The cosmology demanded it. The texts documented it. The question was not whether beings could descend from heaven. The question was what happened when they did. The Hebrew word malak appears 213 times in the Hebrew Bible. It is almost always translated into English as angel, but this translation obscures its original meaning. Malak simply means messenger or agent, someone sent to perform a task or deliver information. The word could refer to a human messenger, a prophet, or a supernatural being sent by God. Context determined the meaning. In early biblical texts, the Malak YHWH, messenger of YHWH, is often indistinguishable from YHWH himself. In Genesis 16, Hagar encounters the Malak YHWH in the wilderness, but the text seamlessly shifts between calling this figure the messenger and YHWH as if they were aspects of the same presence. In Genesis 22, the Malak YHWH calls to Abram from heaven to stop the sacrifice of Isaac, speaking in the first person as God. These messengers were not independent agents with their own wills. They were extensions of divine will, manifestations of divine presence. But not all Malachim fit this pattern. In other texts, particularly those outside the biblical canon, messengers from heaven possessed autonomy, personality, even the capacity for rebellion. The transformation from obedient messenger to autonomous being with dangerous desires is the heart of the Watcher story. The term Watchers, Erin in Aramaic, Grigoroi in Greek, appears only briefly in the canonical Bible, in Daniel 4:13 and 4:17, where it refers to holy beings who descend from heaven to deliver divine decrees. But in 3rd Enoch, written sometime between the 3rd and 1st centuries BCE, the Watchers become central characters in a cosmic drama. Before examining 1 Enoch, we need to understand its Mesopotamian antecedents. The concept of divine watchers who descended to interact with humanity was not invented by Jewish scribes in the Second Temple period. It was adapted from much older traditions. The Mesopotamian Apkallu have already been mentioned, but their role deserves closer examination. According to the Sumerian king list, a text compiled around 2100 BCE, kingship descended from heaven after the flood. Before the flood, the antediluvian kings ruled for impossibly long periods, tens of thousands of years, and their reigns were guided by the Apkallu. These were not human advisors. They were explicitly described as beings who came from the realm of Ea, Enki, the god of wisdom, who dwelt in the subterranean freshwater ocean called the Apsu. The Apkallu were depicted in Assyrian palace reliefs from the 9th to 7th centuries BCE. They appear as bearded human figures with wings, or as fish-cloaked humanoids, the fish symbolizing their origin in the watery realm of Ea. They stand beside kings, holding buckets and cone-shaped objects, performing purification rituals. These images were not decorative. They represented real beliefs about the origins of civilization and the source of royal authority. But the Apkallu tradition contains a troubling element. While most Apkallu were portrayed as benevolent teachers, some later texts describe Apkallu who corrupted humanity by teaching forbidden knowledge. A fragmentary text from the Library of Ashurbanipal, 7th century BCE, refers to certain Apkallu who violated the commands of the great gods and descended to earth when they should not have descended. This theme, unauthorized descent and the teaching of forbidden knowledge, is precisely what appears in 1 Enoch's account of the Watchers. The continuity is too specific to be coincidental. Jewish scribes in the Persian and Hellenistic periods were familiar with Mesopotamian traditions. They read Akkadian texts, translated Babylonian astronomical treatises, adopted and adapted mythological motifs. The Watcher narrative is best understood as a Jewish reinterpretation of ancient Near Eastern traditions about descending divine sages. But the Jewish version made crucial changes. In Mesopotamian tradition, the Apkallu descended before the flood with divine approval to civilize humanity. In 3rd Enoch, the Watchers descend in direct defiance of cosmic law to satisfy personal desire. The Mesopotamian version celebrated the descent as the origin of wisdom. The Jewish version condemned it as the origin of corruption. The Book of Enoch describes 200 Watchers who, in the days of Jared, a figure from the genealogy in Genesis 5, descend to Mount Hermon. Mount Hermon is a real place. A triple-peaked mountain on the modern border between Lebanon, Syria and Israel, rising over 9,000 feet. In antiquity it marked the northern boundary of Israelite territory and was associated with Baal Hermon, a Canaanite deity. The choice of location is significant. Hermon was understood as a liminal space, a high place where heaven and earth nearly touched. According to 1 Enoch 6, the Watchers gather on Hermon and swear a mutual oath, binding themselves together in their decision to descend and take human wives. The text names their leaders, Shemihaza, or Semjaza, Azazel, Amaros, Barakiel, Kokabeel, Bul, and 15 others. Each name has etymological meaning in Hebrew or Aramaic. Shemihaza means, "my name has seen." Azazel possibly means, "God strengthens," or scapegoat. Kokabeel means star of God. These are not generic demon names invented for literary effect. They are carefully constructed to suggest celestial origin and identity. The text is explicit about their motive. They saw the daughters of men, that they were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves from all those they chose. This is not rape, though later interpretations often assume sexual violence. The language indicates choice and selection, lakach, to take seo, the same verb used in Genesis 2:22 when God takes a rib from Adam to form Eve. It's the verb of marriage formation. The Watchers are choosing wives according to their own criteria. Who were these daughters of men? The phrase Bat Adam in Hebrew is simply human women, literally daughters of Adam, or daughters of humanity. But the term may carry class implications. If the Watchers represent elite beings of high status, the daughters of men may represent ordinary humans, not the daughters of kings or priests. This would make the unions particularly transgressive, not just crossing the heaven-earth boundary, but also crossing social hierarchies. Yet Enoch 7 describes the immediate consequences. And the women became pregnant and gave birth to great giants whose height was 3,000 ells. An ell, cubit, was approximately 18 inches, making these beings full 500 feet tall, clearly hyperbolic. Later versions of the text reduce this to 300 ells, 450 feet, or simply describe them as 300 cubits, without clarity on whether this refers to height or some other measure. The exaggeration serves a purpose, to communicate that the offspring were fundamentally different from ordinary humans, visibly and dramatically so. These offspring are called Nephilim in Genesis 6:4, Gibor in some texts meaning mighty ones, and Rephaim in later biblical passages, but while Enoch calls them giants, literally the great ones, and describes them as consuming all the food of humanity, then turning to devour each other when food ran out. They are portrayed as threats to creation itself, beings whose hybrid nature makes them fundamentally incompatible with the normal order of existence. But the Watcher's transgression was not only sexual, whilst Enoch 8 provides a detailed list of forbidden knowledge taught by specific Watchers to humanity. Azazel taught men to make swords, knives, shields, breastplates, the technology of warfare. Shemhaza taught enchantments and root cutting, the arts of magic and herbalism. Almaros taught the resolving of enchantments, perhaps counter-magic or protective spells. Barakiel taught astrology. Kokbiel taught the signs of the stars, presumably astronomical knowledge beyond mere observation. Ezekiel taught knowledge of clouds, meteorology or weather prediction. Arachiel taught the signs of the earth, perhaps geology or divination through earth signs. Shamsiel taught the signs of the sun as solar observation and timekeeping. Sariel taught the course of the moon, lunar astronomy and calendar calculation. The text also states that Azazel taught women cosmetics and jewellery, so that the world was changed. This detail is often dismissed as misogynistic fantasy, but it reflects a real anxiety in ancient cultures about technological and social change. The sudden appearance of new materials, new weapons, new forms of adornment, these disrupted traditional patterns and created new forms of inequality and power. What the text is describing beneath its mythological surface is the experience of rapid technological advancement. Someone taught metallurgy, someone discovered how to predict eclipses, someone figured out how to make pigments for cosmetics. To traditional agricultural communities, these developments could feel like invasions from outside, forbidden knowledge brought by beings who didn't belong among humans. The Watcher narrative transforms this historical experience into theological crisis. The problem is not that humans learned these things, but that they learned them from the wrong teachers. The knowledge itself is not inherently evil, but its source is contaminated. It comes from beings who violated cosmic law to share it. This is why later Jewish tradition became so obsessed with distinguishing legitimate from illegitimate knowledge. The Torah, knowledge revealed by God through Moses was legitimate. All other knowledge was suspect, potentially tainted by its association with the rebellious Watchers. This anxiety about unauthorized knowledge would shape Jewish intellectual culture for centuries, creating a tension between the desire to understand the world and the fear of transgressing divine boundaries. But before exploring the consequences, we must ask, how do we know any of this? How did the Watcher narrative survive to be discovered in the 20th century? The caves above Qumran, in the cliffs overlooking the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea, are not impressive to look at. They are narrow, irregular openings in soft limestone, eroded by millennia of wind and seasonal rain. In summer they are furnaces. In winter they are barely habitable. No one would choose to live there, but someone chose to hide something there. Between 1947 and 1956, in 11 different caves within a 2-kilometre radius, archaeologists and Bedouin treasure hunters discovered approximately 950 scrolls and scroll fragments, representing about 500 different texts. They had been placed in clay jars, wrapped in linen, sealed with pitch. The scrolls dated from the 3rd century BCE to the 1st century CE, spanning a period of intense religious and political upheaval in Judea. Among these scrolls were the oldest existing copies of biblical texts, manuscripts of Isaiah, Psalms, Deuteronomy, and other books of the Hebrew Bible predating any previously known version by 1,000 years. These alone would have made the Dead Sea Scrolls the most important archaeological discovery of the 20th century. But mixed with the biblical texts were dozens of non-canonical writings, texts that had never been included in the Hebrew Bible, texts that Jewish and Christian authorities had declared apocryphal or heretical, texts that most scholars assumed had been lost forever. Cave 4, the most productive of the 11 caves, yielded fragments from 7 different manuscripts of Wat Enoch. 7 copies. That's more copies than were found of many biblical books. The community at Qumran, whoever they were, considered 1 Enoch authoritative scripture. Also found in Cave 4, fragments of the Book of Giants, a text previously known only from medieval Manichaean sources. The Qumran fragments were in Aramaic and dated to the 1st century BCE, 1,000 years older than the Manichaean versions. The text expands on 1 Enoch's narrative, providing names and stories of individual Nephilim, the giant offspring of the Watcher human unions. The fragments are tantalizing and frustrating in equal measure. 4Q531, one of the Book of Giants fragments, preserves part of a story about 2 brothers, Ohia and Hekia, sons of the Watcher Shemi-Haza. They have disturbing dreams about the coming destruction of the world, dreams symbolized by a tablet being plunged into water and emerging blank, except for 3 names. They consult Enoch, the human seer who has access to heavenly mysteries, asking him to interpret the dream. The text breaks off before Enoch's full answer, but the implication is clear. The giants know they are doomed. Their existence is incompatible with the ordered cosmos, and divine judgment is coming. Another fragment, 4Q203, preserves a list of names, likely the names of the 200 Watchers who descended. The names are partially damaged but include recognizable figures from Enoch, Yekon, Asbeel, Gadriel, Penemuel. The list format suggests a formal record, not a narrative embellishment. These beings were understood as specific individuals, not generic demons. Why would a Jewish community preserve multiple copies of texts describing angel-human marriages? The answer lies in the identity of the Qumran community itself. Most scholars identify the Qumran community with the Essenes, a Jewish sect described by Josephus, Philo, and Pliny the Elder as living in celibate communities near the Dead Sea, practicing ritual purity, studying scripture intensively, and awaiting divine intervention to purge the world of wickedness. The Essenes rejected the Jerusalem priesthood as corrupt and believed themselves to be the true Israel, the remnant who maintained covenant faithfulness, while the rest of the nation fell into apostasy. For such a community, the Watchers' story was not ancient mythology. It was a template for understanding their own time. Just as the Watchers had corrupted the antediluvian world by transgressing boundaries and teaching forbidden knowledge, the Jerusalem priesthood was corrupting contemporary Judaism by allowing Hellenistic influence, making compromises with Rome, and abandoning purity laws. The Nephilim, hybrid monsters who threatened creation, were analogous to the cultural hybrids produced by intermarriage between Jews and Gentiles, between the holy and the profane. Fane. This interpretation is supported by other Qumran texts. The Damascus document, found in both Qumran and in a medieval Cairo synagogue, explicitly refers to the Watchers as a warning against sexual immorality and boundary violation. For in ancient times Moses and Aaron arose by the hand of the Prince of Lights, but Belial raised up Jans and his brother by his evil device when Israel was delivered for the first time. But in the age of devastation of the land there arose those who removed the boundary and led Israel astray. The removal of the boundary is the core transgression, the blurring of categories that God established at creation. Heaven and earth, holy and common, Israel and the nations. The Watcher's story dramatized the catastrophic consequences of removing these boundaries, but the Qumran community did not invent this interpretation. They inherited it from earlier Jewish tradition, and that tradition is preserved in whole Enoch itself. The Book of Word Enoch is not a single book, but a compilation of 5 originally independent sections, written by different authors at different times, probably between the 3rd and 1st centuries BCE. The Book of the Watchers, chapters 136, the Book of Parables, chapters 37-71, the Astronomical Book, chapters 72-82, the Book of Dreams, chapters 83-90, the Epistle of Enoch, chapters 91-108. The Book of the Watchers, which contains the Watcher narrative, is the oldest section, probably dating to the 3rd century BCE, during the early Hellenistic period. This was a time of intense cultural conflict in Judea. Following Alexander the Great's conquest of the Near East in 322 BCE, Greek culture, language, and customs flooded into Jewish society. Gymnasiums were built in Jerusalem. Young Jewish men adopted Greek names, wore Greek clothing, and in some cases underwent painful surgery to reverse circumcision so they could participate naked in Greek athletic competitions without being identifiable as Jews. To traditionalist Jews, this was not simply cultural evolution. It was apostasy, the abandonment of covenant identity in favour of foreign ways. And it produced a question. How did this happen? How did the chosen people, who had been commanded to remain separate from the nations, become so enamoured with the foreign gods and foreign customs? The Watcher narrative provided an answer. This had happened before. In the time before the flood, boundaries were violated, forbidden knowledge was taught, and the world became so corrupted that God had to destroy it. The lesson was clear. Boundary violation leads to destruction. The only way to survive the coming judgment was to maintain absolute separation from contaminants. This interpretation was not peripheral. It was central to how many Jews in the Second Temple period understood their history and their crisis. Wase Enoch was widely read. It's quoted or alluded to in the New Testament. Jude 14-15 quotes 1 Enoch 1:9 directly, and Jude 6 refers to angels who did not keep their own position but abandoned their proper dwelling, being kept in chains for judgment, a clear reference to the Watchers. The Book of Jubilees, another Second Temple text found at Qumran, retells the Watcher story with additional detail, emphasizing that the Watcher's sin was mixing categories that should remain distinct. Jubilees frames the entire Torah as a system designed to prevent boundary violations like the one that led to the flood. But if the Watcher story was so important, why isn't it in the Bible? The answer is complicated and involves the politics of canon formation. When the Pharisees and later rabbis consolidated the Hebrew Bible after the destruction of the Jerusalem Temple in 70 CE, they excluded many texts that had been popular during the Second Temple period. And Enoch was among them. The reasons were multiple. First, one's Enoch's angelology was too elaborate. It named and described angels in ways that risked treating them as independent powers rather than obedient servants of God. This could lead to angel worship, something Jews had been accused of and needed to avoid. Second, one Enoch's calendar contradicted the lunar calendar that had become standard in Judaism. The astronomical book prescribes a 3-4-day solar calendar, incompatible with the lunar calendar used for determining festivals. Third, one Enoch's emphasis on Enoch as recipient of divine revelation potentially competed with Moses, whose revelation at Sinai was the foundation of rabbinic authority. Fourth, and perhaps most important, the Watcher narrative was simply too dangerous. It suggested that angels, beings created to serve God, could rebel, could desire, could make choices contrary to divine will. This opened troubling questions about the nature of evil, the freedom of heavenly beings, and the stability of cosmic order. Safer to exclude it. Let the story fade. Focus on Torah, on law, on the covenant between God and Israel. But the story didn't fade. It survived in Ethiopia, where one Enoch was preserved in Giy's translation and remained part of the Ethiopian Orthodox biblical canon. It survived in fragmentary Greek and Latin translations, and it survived in the caves of Qumran, sealed in jars waiting for Bedouin shepherds in 1947. The rediscovery of Wasat Enoch in Hebrew and Aramaic forced scholars to reconsider everything they thought they knew about early Judaism. Here was a text that had shaped Jewish thought in the Second Temple period, that had influenced the New Testament, that had been considered scripture by at least some Jewish communities, and it had been almost completely forgotten. The Watcher narrative was not a late Christian invention or a Gnostic corruption. It was ancient Jewish tradition, rooted in even older Near Eastern mythology, preserved because it answered urgent questions about evil, corruption, suffering, and the apparent instability of the cosmic order. The marriages between Watchers and human women were not peripheral mythological details. They were the explanation for why the world was broken and what had to be done to fix it. To understand why the Watcher human unions were considered the ultimate transgression, we must reconstruct ancient Jewish cosmology and the legal principles that govern the relationship between heaven and earth. The Hebrew term shamayim, usually translated heaven or heavens, appears 421 times in the Hebrew Bible. It refers to the sky, the realm above the earth, and by extension the dwelling place of God and the celestial beings who serve him. But Shamayim was not conceived as empty space or an abstract spiritual realm. It was understood as a structured, ordered domain with its own geography, population, and laws. The book of Job, particularly chapters 1-2 and 38-41, provides the most detailed biblical glimpse into heaven's structure. In Job 1:6, the sons of God came to present themselves before Hor-Ishbuh, and the Satan also came among them. The language is that of a royal court. The sons of God, Bene Elohim, literally sons of gods or divine beings, are courtiers presenting themselves to the king. This is not a gathering of equals. It's a hierarchical assembly where superior beings receive assignments and report on their activities. Job 38:7 refers to the morning stars singing together and the sons of God shouting for joy at creation. Stars and divine beings are parallel terms, suggesting a conceptual overlap between celestial objects and celestial persons. This parallelism appears throughout the Hebrew Bible and becomes explicit in later Jewish texts. In Enoch, the stars themselves are angels, and the angels are stars, not metaphorically, but ontologically. Azazel, in one tradition, is the star Azazel. Kokabeel is literally star of God. This cosmology has profound implications for understanding the Watcher transgression. If angels are stars, fixed in their courses, governed by the predictable laws assigned to specific positions, then their descent to Earth is not merely a moral failing. It is a cosmic disorder, equivalent to stars falling from their orbits. It is the kind of category violation that threatens the stability of creation itself. Ancient Jewish texts describe the organization of heaven in detail. The Book of the Watchers, Vern Enoch 136, describes multiple heavens, with angelic guardians stationed at each level. Later Jewish texts expand this to 7 heavens, each with specific functions. The Testament of Levi, a Second Temple text found at Qumran, describes the first heaven containing clouds and weather phenomena, the second heaven containing the powers who will execute vengeance on the spirits of deceit, the third heaven containing the host of the Lord ready for the day of judgment, the fourth and fifth heavens containing angelic choruses, the sixth heaven containing angels who carry prayers and offerings before the Lord, the seventh heaven where the great glory dwells. This is not fantasy world building, it is ancient cosmological science, a systematic attempt to map the structure of reality based on observation, tradition, and theological reasoning. The system accounts for different types of phenomena, weather, judgment, worship, by assigning them to different levels of heaven, each staffed by appropriate angelic administrators. Within this system, the Watchers occupied a specific role. According to 1 Enoch, they were stationed in a lower heaven, close enough to Earth to observe human affairs, which was their assignment. The name Watchers reflects their function. They watched, they observed, they reported, but they were not authorized to intervene except under divine command. Their descent violated the fundamental structure of this system. They left their posts, they abandoned their assigned stations, and most critically, they crossed the boundary between heaven and earth, a boundary that was not merely spatial but ontological. The concept of ontological boundaries requires explanation. In ancient Near Eastern thought, different types of beings belong to different realms, not just as a matter of residence, but as a matter of essence. Fish belonged in water, birds in air, animals on land, humans on earth, divine beings in heaven. These were not arbitrary categories. They reflected the fundamental order established at creation, when God separated light from darkness, waters above from waters below, dry land from sea. Genesis 1 is often read as a creation narrative, but it is more accurately a separation narrative. God creates by dividing, distinguishing, categorizing. The categories are not fluid. Mixing them leads to chaos, the undifferentiated state that existed before creation began. This is why Leviticus 19:19 prohibits mingling. You shall not let your cattle breed with a different kind. You shall not sow your field with 2 kinds of seed. You shall not wear a garment of cloth made of 2 kinds of material. These laws seem arbitrary to modern readers, but they reflect a cosmological principle. Categories must remain distinct. What God has separated must not be mixed. The Watcher-human unions were the ultimate mixing. They combined the ontologically distinct, heavenly and earthly, immortal and mortal, spiritual and physical. The offspring, the Nephilim, were category violations made flesh. They were living proof that the cosmic order had been breached. But why should anyone care? If the unions were consensual, if both parties desired them, what was the harm? The ancient answer involves the concept of contagion. Holiness and impurity were not merely moral categories in ancient Jewish thought. They were quasi-physical properties that could spread through contact. A holy object made adjacent objects holy. An impure object contaminated adjacent objects. The temple system existed primarily to manage these contagious properties. to maintain zones of holiness by preventing contamination from outside. The Watchers, as heavenly beings, carried the property of holiness. They belonged to the realm of the sacred. Human women, as earthly beings, carried the property of mortality. They belonged to the profane realm. The union of the two created an impossible contamination. The Watchers became contaminated by mortality. They fell, lost their status, became demons rather than angels. The human women became contaminated by otherworldly power. They bore children who should not exist, hybrids that the earth could not sustain. This is not misogyny, though it has been weaponized for misogynistic purposes throughout history. The texts do not blame the women for the Watchers' desire. The transgression belongs to the Watchers who initiated the unions, but the texts do recognize that the women bore the physical consequences. They carried and birthed beings who would become destroyers. Other ancient cultures viewed divine human unions differently. Greek mythology celebrated them. Zeus's countless liaisons with mortal women produced heroes. Perseus, Heracles, Helen of Troy. These were not disasters but glories. The offspring became founders of cities, winners of wars, objects of cult worship. The difference lies in cosmology. Greek gods were not ontologically separate from humans. They were more powerful, immortal, capable of shape-shifting, but they existed on the same plane of reality. They ate, drank, felt emotions, engaged in sex. The boundaries between divine and human were permeable by design. Jewish cosmology rejected this. Weish was ontologically other, not a being within creation, but the creator of being itself. Angels were not lesser gods. They were created servants, agents without independent will or desire. The boundary between heaven and earth was not meant to be permeable, it was meant to be absolute. The Watcher narrative dramatizes what happens when that boundary is breached. Corruption, violence, the production of beings that threaten creation itself, and ultimately destruction. The flood that wipes out the antediluvian world is God's response to the contamination introduced by the angel-human unions. It is not punishment for human wickedness alone. Genesis 6:5 mentions human wickedness, but Genesis 6:1-4 makes clear that the trigger is the Nephilim, the offspring of boundary violation. Later rabbinic tradition tried to minimize the supernatural elements of Genesis 6:1-4. The Targums, Aramaic translations and paraphrases of the Hebrew Bible used in synagogues, rendered sons of God as sons of nobles, or sons of judges, removing the angelic interpretation entirely. The rabbis preferred to read the passage as describing powerful men taking multiple wives, a social problem but not a cosmic one. But the earlier tradition preserved in St. Enoch, Jubilees, the Dead Sea Scrolls and the New Testament maintained the supernatural reading, and that tradition insisted on a key point. What made the unions forbidden was not sex itself, but the crossing of realms. It was the fact that beings who belonged in heaven chose to remain on earth. They preferred mortal women to their assigned positions in the cosmic order. They valued their own desires over obedience to divine command. This is rebellion, not the armed rebellion that of Milton's Paradise Lost, where Satan raises armies against Yin. It is subtler and in some ways more dangerous, the rebellion of refusal, the rebellion of absence. The Watchers simply don't go back. They stay on Earth, they make families, they teach their children. They become invested in terrestrial existence. And this, the texts insist, cannot be tolerated. Heaven and earth cannot merge. The categories cannot collapse. If they do, creation unravels. The Watchers must be removed. The Nephilim must be destroyed. The boundary must be restored. The women are almost invisible in these texts. They have no names. They speak no words. They are described only in relation to their desirability, and the Watchers saw that the daughters of men were beautiful. This silence is not unusual. Ancient Near Eastern texts rarely record women's voices, especially not the voices of ordinary women. What we know about women's lives in the ancient Levant comes from indirect evidence, archaeological remains, legal documents, passing references in larger narratives. Iron Age Canaan and Israel, the period from roughly 1200 to 586 BCE, when the foundational layers of the Watcher narrative were forming, was an agricultural society organized around extended family units. Women's primary roles were defined by this economy: food production, textile manufacture, child rearing, household management. A woman's status derived from her position within the family: daughter, wife, mother, widow. Archaeological excavations of Iron Age II houses in the central hill country of Canaan reveal a consistent architectural pattern: 3 or 4 rooms arranged around a central courtyard, often with a stone-lined storage pit and grain-grinding installation. This was the space of women's daily work. They ground grain into flour using saddle querns, back-breaking labour that wore down teeth and caused chronic joint problems. They tended gardens, processed milk into cheese, wove cloth from sheep's wool and goat hair, cooked over small hearth fires, drew water from cisterns or springs. The average life expectancy for women in this period was perhaps 35 years. Repeated pregnancies, childbirth complications, infections, malnutrition, and hard physical labour took their toll. Skeletal remains show evidence of vitamin deficiencies, bone fractures, dental disease, arthritis. These were not lives of leisure or romance, but they were also not lives without meaning or agency. Women controlled significant household resources. They managed food storage, decided daily meals, oversaw children's education, negotiated with neighbours, participated in harvest festivals. Within the constraints of their society, they made choices, exercised judgment, influenced family decisions. Legal texts from the ancient Near East, the Code of Hammurabi, Middle Assyrian laws, Hittite laws, biblical law codes reveal women's legal status. Women could own property, though it typically passed to male heirs. They could initiate divorce in cases of abuse or abandonment, though more easily for women than men. They could testify in court, though their testimony sometimes carried less weight than men's. They were protected against certain forms of violence, though punishments for offences against women often went to male relatives rather than the women themselves. Marriage in ancient Israel was not primarily a romantic relationship, but an economic and reproductive alliance between families. Marriages were arranged, though evidence suggests women's consent mattered in many cases. A bride price, mohar, was paid by the groom's family to the bride's family, and a dowry often accompanied the bride to her new household. These transfers were substantial. They represented years of labour value and protected women's economic interests in case of widowhood or divorce. Sexual relations before marriage were prohibited for women but not for men, a double standard that reflects the importance placed on ensuring paternity in a society where inheritance followed male lines. But the prohibition was not absolute. Deuteronomy 22:28-29 specifies that if a man rapes an unbetrothed virgin, he must marry her and pay her father 50 shekels, a law that protects the woman's economic future in a culture where non-virginity drastically reduced marriage prospects, though at the terrible cost of forcing her to marry her rapist. Women in biblical texts occasionally exercise remarkable autonomy. Deborah judges Israel and leads armies. Jael kills an enemy general. Ruth initiates her own marriage. The woman of Proverbs 31 manages household, buys fields, plants vineyards, manufactures goods for sale, and is praised for her wisdom and capability. But these are exceptional women, presented as exceptional precisely because their behaviour differs from the norm. For most women, life was constrained by geography, economy, family obligation, and cultural expectation. Into this world, the text says, the Watchers descended. And they saw that the daughters of men were beautiful. What does beautiful mean in this context? The Hebrew term yafeh refers to physical attractiveness, but also to something like good or well made, the same term used in Genesis 1 when God sees that creation is good. It suggests something desirable, something that draws attention, something that creates longing. But who were these women? The text calls them Bat Adam, daughters of humanity, suggesting they were not the daughters of rulers or priests, but ordinary women. If the Watchers had chosen the daughters of kings, the text would likely say so. Royal marriages were significant political events. The phrase daughters of men suggests lower social status, perhaps the daughters of farmers, shepherds, artisans, women without powerful fathers to protect them. The Watchers took wives for themselves. The Hebrew verb lakach, to take, is the standard term for marriage formation, but it can also mean simply to take in the sense of acquiring or seizing. The ambiguity is probably intentional. Were these marriages negotiated with fathers, with bride prices paid, or were they coerced unions, powerful beings taking what they wanted? The text doesn't say, but later Jewish interpretations lean toward coercion. Jubilees 5:1 says the Watchers began to defile themselves with the daughters of men, using language of pollution rather than marriage. The Damascus document describes the Watchers as having walked in the stubbornness of their hearts and committed fornication. But 1 Enoch itself is more ambiguous. The Watchers swore an oath before descending, suggesting a deliberate, premeditated decision. They chose wives, suggesting selection rather than random violence. They bore children and taught them forbidden knowledge, suggesting ongoing relationships, not one-time assaults. Perhaps the most honest reading is that these were genuine relationships, genuine desires, genuine loves, and that this makes the transgression worse, not better. The Watchers didn't simply rape human women and return to heaven. They stayed. They formed families. They became invested in earthly existence. They chose humanity over their proper place in the cosmos. And the women, we can only imagine. Imagine a young woman, perhaps 16 or 17 years old, daughter of a shepherd family in the hill country near Bashan. She grinds grain in the morning, tends goats in the afternoon, draws water at dusk. Her marriage has been arranged to a neighbouring family's son. The bride price is being negotiated. Then a being appears, not a human man, something else. Shining, impossibly tall, speaking with a voice like thunder or music or something she has no words for. He says he has chosen her. He offers things no human husband could offer: knowledge, power, children who will be great ones, mighty ones. Does she consent? Does she have a choice? If she refuses, will he leave? If she accepts, does she understand what she's accepting? The text doesn't tell us. The woman's experience is not recorded. Only the consequence: she bears a child. The child is not human, not entirely. The child grows to enormous size, consumes vast amounts of food, exhibits strength and appetites that terrify everyone around him. The child is called Nephilim, fallen one, or Geberim, mighty one. But what the mother calls him we will never know, and perhaps, years later, when the floodwaters rise, when the world drowns, when everything is destroyed because of what the Watchers did and what these women bore, perhaps someone remembers her name. But it isn't written down. Only the story remains. The sons of God took the daughters of men. The invisibility of these women in the text is itself revealing. The Watcher narrative, like most ancient literature, is told from the perspective of cosmic powers, divine beings, great events. The women are plot devices. They are the reason for the Watcher's fall, the mothers of the monsters, the agents of cosmic contamination. But they were also human. They lived in specific places at specific times. They had families, memories, fears, hopes. They were caught in something they could not control or fully understand, and they paid the price, along with all humanity, when the flood came. Later Christian tradition would project this narrative onto Mary, mother of Jesus. Like the daughters of men, Mary was chosen by a heavenly being. Like them, she bore a child who was both human and other than human. But unlike the Watcher unions, Mary's encounter with the divine was presented as pure, obedient, blessed. The angelic announcement to Mary in Luke 1 carefully contrasts with the Watcher narrative. Gabriel comes as a messenger with news, not as a suitor with desires. Mary conceives through divine power, not through sexual union. The child Jesus is holy, not a monster. The contrast is deliberate. The Gospel writers knew the Watcher tradition. They knew it was a story of forbidden unions producing catastrophe, so they told a different story, an authorized union producing not destruction, but salvation. Mary becomes the anti-type of the Watcher's wives, the woman whose cooperation with divine plan reverses the curse of the original boundary violation. But this Christian reinterpretation only emphasizes how the original story haunted ancient imagination. The marriage of heaven and earth was the most powerful, most dangerous thing anyone could imagine. It could either destroy the world or save it. And the women who bore the children of such unions, whether Nephilim or Messiah, carried in their bodies the crisis of the cosmos itself. The term Nephilim appears only twice in the Hebrew Bible. Genesis 6:4. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went to the daughters of men and had children by them. They were the heroes of old, men of renown. And Numbers 13:33, where Israelite spies report seeing Nephilim in Canaan. We saw the Nephilim there, the descendants of Anak come from the Nephilim. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them. The etymology of Nephilim is disputed. Most scholars derive it from the Hebrew root naphal, meaning to fall. If this is correct, Nephilim means fallen ones, those who fell, or those born from those who fell. The Greek Septuagint translates Nephilim as gigantes, giants, which became the standard Christian interpretation. But another possibility exists. The root NPL in Hebrew can also mean to attack or to cause to fall. In this reading, Nephilim would mean attackers, or those who cause others to fall, or essentially warriors or violent men. This reading fits Numbers 13, where the Nephilim are encountered as enemies to be feared. Either way, the Nephilim were understood as fundamentally other, not fully human, defined by their extraordinary nature. The question is, what made them extraordinary? 1 Enoch provides the most detailed description. The Nephilim were of enormous size, consumed all the food produced by humans, then began to devour the humans themselves, then turned on each other. They are presented as beings whose appetites exceed normal bounds, more than human hunger, more than human violence, more than the earth can sustain. The Book of Giants expands this portrait. The fragmentary Qumran texts preserve names and stories of individual Nephilim, Ohia and Hehia, sons of Shemi-Hazza, Mahweh, son of the Watcher Barakel. Gilgamesh, yes, the hero of the Mesopotamian epic, is identified in the Book of Giants as one of the Nephilim, reinterpreting the Sumerian tradition of Gilgamesh as 2/3 divine and 1/3 human. The Book of Giants portrays the Nephilim as tormented beings. They have disturbing dreams about their coming destruction. They fight among themselves. They seek knowledge from Enoch, the human sage who has access to heavenly mysteries, trying to understand what they are and why they are doomed. There is tragedy in this portrayal. The Nephilim did not choose to be born. They are victims of their father's rebellion, born into a world that cannot accommodate their existence. But they are also threats. The text is clear about this. Their presence destabilizes creation. Their appetites consume resources meant for humans. Their violence escalates beyond normal bounds of warfare or conflict. They represent hybridization run amok, the consequence of mixing categories that should remain distinct. The association of Nephilim with giants is ancient but not universal. The Septuagint's translation giants influenced all subsequent Christian interpretation, but Jewish tradition was more diverse. Targum Onkelos renders Nephilim as Gibrioes, or mighty ones, emphasizing power rather than size. Targum Pseudo-Jonathan calls them warriors, again focusing on violence rather than stature. Why the emphasis on size? Partially because of Numbers 13:33, where the spies describe themselves as grasshoppers compared to the Nephilim. Partially because size is a natural metaphor for otherness. To be larger than human is to be more than human, but partially perhaps because of real experiences of encountering unusually tall individuals or populations. Human height variation is significant. The average height of adult males in ancient Israel was probably around 5 feet, but individuals with genetic conditions like gigantism or Marfan syndrome can reach 7 feet or more. Certain populations, such as the Anakim mentioned in biblical texts as pre-Israelite inhabitants of Canaan, may have been notably taller on average than Israelite populations. Og, king of Bashan and Midian, is described in Deuteronomy 3:11 as having a bed 9 cubits long and 4 cubits wide, roughly 13 by 6 feet. The text adds, "Is it not in Rabbath of the Ammonites?" suggesting the bed was a real object, preserved as a curiosity, offered as evidence of Og's extraordinary size. Whether Og actually required a bed this large or whether the bed was ceremonial or mythologized, it shows that ancient Israelites linked the pre-conquest inhabitants of the Transjordan with exceptional stature. The Rephaim, mentioned multiple times in biblical texts as pre-Israelite inhabitants of the land, were remembered as giants. Deuteronomy 2:10-11 states, "The Emim formerly lived there, a people strong and numerous, and as tall as the Anakites. Like the Anakites, they too were considered Rephaim." The name Rephaim literally means shades or ghosts, connecting them with the underworld, suggesting they were seen not merely as tall humans but as liminal beings associated with death and the realm below. Archaeological evidence provides some context. The dolmen fields of the Golan Heights and Bashan, massive stone structures consisting of upright stone supporting horizontal capstones, date to the early Bronze Age, 3300 to 2000 BCE, and have been associated in local tradition with giants or ancient heroes. Whether they were burial monuments, ritual structures, or something else, they required enormous labour to construct and suggested to later populations that the builders must have been beings of extraordinary strength. Skeletal remains from the ancient Near East occasionally show individuals of unusual height. A burial at Tel Es-Sediyeh in Jordan, dated to the late Bronze Age, contained a male skeleton over 6 feet tall, significantly above average for the period. But no archaeological evidence supports the existence of populations averaging 7 or 8 feet in height, let alone the 15-foot giants described in hyperbolic texts like 1 Enoch. The disconnect between textual description and archaeological reality suggests that giant functioned as much as a category as a measurement. To be a giant was to be fundamentally other, to belong to a different kind of being. This fits the Nephilim narrative. They were not just tall humans but hybrids, born from the union of 2 incompatible types of existence. Greek mythology offers a parallel. The Gigantes, children of Gaia, Earth, impregnated by the blood of Uranus, Sky, were monstrous beings who warred against the Olympian gods. Like the Nephilim, they were products of a boundary violation, Sky and Earth mixing, and like the Nephilim, they threatened cosmic order and had to be destroyed. The difference is that in Greek tradition, the giants' destruction was cause for celebration. In Jewish tradition, it was cause for grief, not because the Nephilim didn't deserve destruction, but because their existence was itself a tragedy, a corruption of creation that should never have occurred. The Nephilim were also associated with forbidden knowledge. According to 1 Enoch 8, the Watchers taught their hybrid children the skills they had taught humanity: warfare, metallurgy, astrology, magic. The Nephilim became masters of these arts, amplifying the damage their fathers had done. They weren't merely consumers and destroyers, they were sophisticates, possessors of knowledge that gave them advantage over ordinary humans. This adds another dimension to the threat. The Nephilim weren't just physically dangerous, they were culturally dangerous. They represented a technological and intellectual elite whose power derived from sources outside normal human development. In a society that valued tradition and suspicious of rapid change, such figures would be terrifying. Later Jewish tradition tried to domesticate the Nephilim by disconnecting them from the Watchers. The most common rabbinic interpretation of Genesis 6:1-4 held that sons of God meant sons of nobles or sons of judges, powerful human men who took multiple wives and produced violent offspring. This removed the supernatural element entirely, making the Nephilim merely the products of polygamy and social injustice. But the earlier tradition, preserved in 1 Enoch and echoed in the New Testament, maintained that the Nephilim were genuinely hybrid, part heavenly, part earthly, and therefore doomed. Jude 6-7 links angels who did not keep their own position with Sodom and Gomorrah, which likewise indulged in sexual immorality and pursued unnatural desire. The language makes clear that the angels' sin was a sexual transgression involving a boundary violation, and Peter 2:4-5 is even more explicit. God did not spare the angels when they sinned, but cast them into hell and committed them to chains of deepest darkness to be kept until the judgment. And if he did not spare the ancient world, even though he saved Noah, a herald of righteousness, with 7 others, when he brought a flood on the world of the ungodly. The sequence links angelic sin, the flood, and the destruction of the ancient world. So the early Christians, like the Qumran community, read Genesis 6:1-4 supernaturally. They believed the Nephilim were real, were hybrids, and were the reason God destroyed the antediluvian world. This interpretation creates a problem. If the Nephilim were destroyed in the flood, why does Numbers 13:33 say they were still in Canaan during the Israelite exodus from Egypt? Genesis 6:4 itself anticipates this question. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward. After the flood. How did Nephilim survive the flood? The texts don't say explicitly, but several possibilities are implied. Either some Nephilim survived the flood itself, unlikely given the narrative's emphasis on total destruction, or new Watcher human unions occurred after the flood, possible but not described in the texts, or the Nephilim of Numbers 13 were not the offspring of Watchers but descendants of Ham, Noah's son, who were somehow tainted or different, or, the most likely reading, the term Nephilim in Numbers 13 simply refers to unusually tall or powerful people, using an ancient term without implying actual Watcher ancestry. The confusion reflects the difficulty ancient interpreters had with these texts. If the Watchers' rebellion was punished definitively by the flood, why does the world remain full of evil? If the Nephilim were destroyed, why do threats to Israel's existence continue? The category Nephilim became a way to name any other who threatened the community. Canaanites, Philistines, Amalekites, anyone whose power seemed disproportionate or whose origin seemed mysterious. But at the core of the tradition remained a memory, or a belief in a memory. There had been beings who were not fully human. They had possessed extraordinary abilities. They had been born from a union that should never have occurred, and their destruction had required divine intervention on a catastrophic scale. Whether this memory reflected actual events, or whether it was a mythological way of processing cultural encounters with foreign peoples, technological disruptions and social upheaval, the Nephilim served a crucial function in ancient Jewish thought. They explained why the world was broken. They provided an origin story for evil that did not blame God and did not make evil inherent to humanity. Evil came from outside, from a violation of cosmic boundaries, and if evil came from outside, it could in principle be expelled, purged, destroyed, and creation could be restored to its original purity. This hope, born from the nightmare of the Nephilim, would shape Jewish eschatology for centuries to come. Knowledge is dangerous. This is the subtext, sometimes the explicit text, of nearly every ancient Near Eastern wisdom tradition. The Mesopotamian myth of Adapa tells of a sage who was granted wisdom by the god Ea but was tricked into refusing the gift of immortality. The result: humanity has knowledge but remains mortal. Genesis 2:3 tells of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which humans were forbidden to eat from. The result: knowledge brings death. But why is knowledge dangerous? The answer lies in the ancient understanding of knowledge as power, specifically power that disrupts established order. To know something is to be able to manipulate it. To know metallurgy is to be able to make weapons. To know astronomy is to be able to predict omens and claim privileged access to divine will. To know pharmacology is to be able to heal or poison. Knowledge creates inequality, enables violence, disrupts tradition. The Watcher narrative takes this anxiety and gives it narrative form. Forbidden knowledge came from outside. It was taught by beings who should not have taught it, to humans who were not meant to possess it, and the result was civilization. But a civilization built on violation, corruption, and violence. 1 Enoch 8 provides the detailed accounting. Azazel taught men to make swords and knives and shields and breastplates. Shemahazah taught enchantments and root-cutting, magic and herbalism. Armoros taught the resolving of enchantments, presumably counter-magic. Barakiel taught astrology. Kokbiel taught the signs of the stars. Ezekiel taught knowledge of the clouds, weather prediction or manipulation. Arakiel taught the signs of the earth. Shamsiel taught the signs of the sun. Sariel taught the course of the moon. Azazel also taught women how to beautify themselves with cosmetics and precious stones and valuable fabrics. The text adds, "And there arose much godlessness, and they committed fornication, and they were led astray and became corrupt in all their ways." This list is not random. It represents domains of knowledge that in ancient societies were controlled, restricted, surrounded by taboo. Metallurgy was elite craft knowledge, passed from master to apprentice, often associated with divine patronage or supernatural power. In Hittite society, metal workers were a protected class, and the secrets of ironworking were state secrets, punishable by death if revealed to outsiders. Astrology and astronomical observation were priestly domains. The ability to predict eclipses, track planetary movements, and calculate calendars gave priests power over agricultural planning, festival timing, and political decisions. Astronomical tablets from Mesopotamia were kept in temple libraries, not distributed publicly. Magic and herbalism were liminal practices, sometimes accepted, sometimes condemned, always suspect. A person who knew which plants could heal or harm possessed power that could not be easily controlled by social authorities. Such knowledge could be used benevolently or malevolently, making the knower both valuable and dangerous. Even cosmetics and jewellery carried class implications. In ancient societies with sharp distinctions between social ranks, appearance markers mattered. The ability to manufacture pigments for eye paint, to dye fabrics purple with excamotive mollusks, to work gold and silver into ornaments, these were technologies of status distinction. For someone of lower class to adopt elite markers was transgressive, a violation of social boundaries. What 1 Enoch is describing beneath its mythological language is technological and cultural diffusion, the spread of elite knowledge to populations that previously lacked access to it. and the text frames this diffusion as corruption. This framing reflects real historical processes. The Late Bronze Age collapse, around 1200 BCE, saw the sudden spread of ironworking technology throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. Iron, previously rare and expensive, became widely available as the centralized palace economies that had controlled bronze production collapsed. Weapons became easier to make. Small groups could arm themselves and challenge traditional power structures. Empires fell. New political orders emerged. To scribes loyal to the old orders, this must have felt like corruption. The social hierarchy they knew was disrupted. Knowledge that should have been controlled was suddenly in anyone's hands. The result was violence, instability, the collapse of civilization as they understood it. Similarly, the Hellenistic period after Alexander's conquest in the 4th century BCE saw Greek cultural practices spread throughout the Near East. Greek philosophy, science, athletics, language, and sexual norms suddenly became available to Jewish communities. To traditionalists, this felt like invasion, contamination. The old ways were being forgotten. Young people were adopting foreign customs. The boundaries between Israel and the nations were dissolving. The Watcher narrative gave voice to this anxiety. The spread of Hellenistic knowledge and practices was not natural evolution. It was corruption, taught by beings who had violated cosmic law by descending from heaven to earth. To adopt these practices was to participate in the original transgression. To resist them was to maintain the boundaries that God had established at creation. But the text complicates this simple reading. The knowledge the Watchers taught was not inherently evil. Metallurgy enabled better tools as well as better weapons. Astronomy enabled better agriculture. Medicine enabled healing. Even cosmetics enabled beauty, which the text itself acknowledges by describing women as beautiful. The problem was not the knowledge itself, but its source and its effects. Knowledge from legitimate sources, God through Moses, for example, brought life and order. Knowledge from illegitimate sources, rebellious angels, brought death and chaos. The same content, different source, opposite result. This creates a criterion for evaluating knowledge. Where did it come from? Who taught it? For what purpose? A sword could defend or murder. The metallurgy that created the sword was morally neutral, but who taught the metallurgy and why determined whether its spread was blessing or curse. Archaeological evidence shows that technological advancement in the ancient Near East was indeed disruptive. The transition from bronze to iron weaponry changed warfare dramatically. Iron weapons were cheaper to produce and therefore more widely available. Armies could be larger, more expendable. Warfare became more total, more destructive. Cities that had survived centuries were suddenly vulnerable. Similarly, the spread of literacy beyond priestly and royal circles changed power dynamics. A merchant who could read contracts could challenge aristocratic power. A farmer who could read omens could claim religious authority. Knowledge that had been monopolized by elites became accessible to a broader population. This democratization of knowledge was destabilizing to traditional hierarchies. The Watcher narrative captures this destabilization and frames it as cosmic crisis. What humans experienced as social upheaval, the text reframed as the consequence of primordial boundary violation. The world was not changing naturally. It was corrupted, infected by knowledge from outside. This framing had profound implications for how later Jewish communities responded to cultural change. Rather than adapt to new circumstances, they often retreated into stricter boundary maintenance. Rather than integrate new knowledge, they rejected it as contaminated. Rather than negotiate with Hellenistic culture, they resisted it as demonic. The Qumran community exemplified this response. They withdrew from Jerusalem, established a separatist community in the wilderness, maintained strict purity laws, and awaited divine intervention to purge the corruption. They preserved the Book of Enoch because it validated their worldview. The world was corrupt, the corruption came from outside, and only those who maintained absolute separation would survive the coming judgment. But the Watcher narrative also preserved a memory of attraction. The Watchers didn't teach humans reluctantly, they chose to descend. They desired human women, they wanted to share their knowledge. There was genuine relationship, genuine connection across the heaven-earth boundary. And humans, for their part, didn't resist. They welcomed the Watchers, they married them, they learned from them, they bore their children. The tragedy is not just that boundaries were violated. The tragedy is that the violation was mutual, desired, productive. The unions created powerful offspring. The knowledge enabled civilization. And yet the text insists it was wrong. It had to be stopped. Creation itself demanded it. This tension between the attractiveness of boundary crossing and its categorical prohibition runs through the entire Watcher tradition. It is what makes the narrative powerful and disturbing. The Watchers are not purely evil. They bring gifts. They create relationships. They enable human flourishing in certain ways. But they violate the fundamental structure of reality. And for that, everything they create must be destroyed. Later Christian theology would wrestle with this same tension in its doctrine of the fall. Knowledge itself is not evil. God is the source of all truth, but knowledge grasped outside of proper relationship with God becomes poison. The tree of knowledge in Eden was not evil in itself, but eating from it before the proper time, in defiance of divine command, brought death. The Watcher's knowledge was like that tree, real, powerful, potentially good, but offered at the wrong time from the wrong source for the wrong reasons. And accepting it meant death, not just for individuals, but for civilizations, for the entire antediluvian world. Every ancient Near Eastern culture has a flood story. The Sumerians preserved the earliest known version in the tale of Ziusudra, who survives a divine flood sent to destroy humanity. The Akkadian Atrahasis epic dating to the 18th century BCE tells of the gods deciding to destroy noisy humanity with a flood, but the god Enki warns his devotee Atrahasis to build a boat and survive. The Epic of Gilgamesh, in Tablet 11, includes a parallel flood story told by Utnapishtim, the flood survivor who achieved immortality. The biblical flood narrative in Genesis 6:9 shares numerous details with these Mesopotamian accounts. Divine decision to destroy humanity, a righteous man warned by deity, construction of a large boat, survival of family and animals, a bird sent out to test whether waters had receded, landing on a mountain, sacrifice after disembarking, divine promise never to flood the world again. The parallels are too specific to be coincidental. Either the biblical narrative borrowed from Mesopotamian sources, or both drew from a common tradition about a catastrophic flood in the distant past. Most scholars favour borrowing, noting that Israelites in the Babylonian exile, 6th century BCE, would have been exposed to Mesopotamian flood traditions and adapted them to their own theological purposes. But the widespread distribution of flood narratives, not just in Mesopotamia and Israel, but in Egypt, Greece, India, China, and indigenous cultures worldwide, suggests that flood experiences were common enough in human history to generate independent mythological explanations. Major floods did occur in antiquity. The question is whether any single flood was catastrophic enough to generate a universal flood memory. The most dramatic candidate is the flooding of the Black Sea basin around 5600 BCE. The Black Sea had been a freshwater lake during the Ice Age, separated from the Mediterranean by a land bridge at the Bosporus. When glaciers melted and Mediterranean sea levels rose, salt water eventually breached the Bosporus and poured into the Black Sea basin, raising water levels by several hundred feet over a period of months or years. If human communities lived around the shores of the freshwater lake, they would have experienced sudden, catastrophic flooding, displacement, and loss. This hypothesis, proposed by marine geologists William Ryan and Walter Pittman in 1997, remains controversial. Some geological evidence supports it. Other evidence suggests the flooding was gradual rather than catastrophic. But even if the Black Sea flood was sudden, it occurred millennia before the emergence of writing, making it impossible to link directly to recorded flood narratives. Closer to the Mesopotamian heartland, archaeological excavations have found flood deposits at multiple sites. At Leonard Woolley discovered an 11-foot layer of clean clay separating earlier and later occupation levels, which he initially interpreted as evidence of Noah's flood. Later analysis showed the deposit was from a local flood, probably of the Euphrates River, affecting only the region. Similar flood layers were found at Shurapak and other sites, but they date to different periods, ruling out a single universal flood. What archaeology reveals is that major floods were recurring disasters in ancient Mesopotamia. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers were unpredictable, rising suddenly during spring snowmelt, breaking through levees, inundating agricultural land and cities. A sufficiently large flood could destroy an entire city-state's agricultural base, causing mass famine, disease, social collapse, and population displacement. To a community experiencing such a flood, it would feel universal. Their entire world, the territory they knew, the cities they traded with, the farmland that sustained them, would be underwater. Survivors would remember it as the flood, the defining catastrophe of living memory. Oral tradition would preserve the story, perhaps exaggerating details over time, until it became the story of a world-destroying deluge from which only one family survived. The biblical flood narrative in Genesis frames the flood as divine judgment for corruption, specifically the corruption introduced by the Nephilim. Genesis 6:5-6 states, YHWH saw that the wickedness of humankind was great in the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of their hearts was only evil continually. And YHWH was sorry that he had made humankind on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. But Genesis 6:1-4, immediately preceding this, describes the sons of God taking human wives and producing Nephilim. And YHWH saw that the wickedness of humankind was great on the earth. The repetition links the two passages, the wickedness that triggers. The flood is not random human sin, but the specific corruption introduced by angel-human unions. The Enochic tradition makes this link explicit. Wad Enoch 10 describes God commanding the archangel Raphael to bind Azazel and throw him into darkness, commanding Michael to bind Shemhazer and the other watchers, and commanding Gabriel to destroy the Nephilim by making them fight each other. Then, after these preliminary judgments, the flood comes to cleanse the earth of residual corruption. The flood is not merely punishment, it is cosmic reset, purging creation of the contamination introduced by boundary violation. Water returns the world to its pre-creation state, the formless deep of Genesis 1-2, so that creation can begin again, properly ordered this time. This theological interpretation of flood tradition served a specific purpose for communities facing cultural crisis. Just as the antediluvian world became so corrupted it had to be destroyed and restarted, the current world, whether the Hellenized Judaism of the 2nd century BCE or the Roman-occupied Judea of the 1st century CE, was so corrupted it would have to be destroyed and restarted. The flood became a template for eschatological expectation. God had purged the world once, God would purge it again. The mechanism differed. The next purging would be by fire, not water. 2 Peter 3:6-7 makes this explicit. The world of that time was deluged and destroyed by water. By the same word, the present heavens and earth are reserved for fire, being kept for the day of judgment and destruction of the ungodly. But the pattern remained. Corruption beyond repair, divine intervention, total destruction, new beginning. Historically, the flood narrative functioned as a boundary marker between eras. Everything before the flood was the old world, the corrupted world, the world of giants and violence and forbidden knowledge. Everything after the flood was the new world, the purged world, the world where humanity could try again to maintain the boundaries God established. But Genesis itself acknowledges that the new world remained imperfect. Genesis 8:21, after Noah's sacrifice, states, Yahweh said in his heart, I will never again curse the ground because of humankind, for the inclination of the human heart is evil from youth, nor will I ever again destroy every living creature as I have done. The flood solved nothing. Humanity's tendency toward evil remained. The difference was God's commitment not to respond with universal destruction. This creates a tension at the heart of the flood narrative. Was it effective? Did it actually purge corruption? Or did it simply buy time? The answer depends on what you think the corruption was. If the corruption was genetic, literal hybrid offspring of angels and humans, then the flood succeeded. All Nephilim were destroyed with the possible exception of those mysterious Nephilim in Numbers 13. The bloodlines were purged. But if the corruption was knowledge, the skills and arts taught by the Watchers, then the flood failed. Knowledge cannot be drowned. Noah and his family carried knowledge across the flood. They knew metallurgy, astronomy, agriculture. They rebuilt civilization using the same technologies that had corrupted the antediluvian world. The Enochic tradition recognized this problem. According to 1 Enoch, the Watchers themselves were not destroyed by the flood. They were bound in chains in dark places until the final judgment. This means the source of corruption still exists, imprisoned but not eliminated. The knowledge they taught remains in the world. The potential for renewed corruption remains. This is why the Enochic tradition emphasizes ongoing vigilance. The boundaries must be maintained. Mixing must be prevented. Forbidden knowledge must be rejected. Not because corruption has been eliminated, but precisely because it has not been. The flood bought time and space for a faithful remnant to maintain purity until the final judgment when corruption would be eliminated permanently. For the Qumran community, the flood narrative validated their separatism. They were the new Noah, the righteous remnant surviving in an ark of purity while the world drowned in corruption around them. The flood had not yet come, but it was coming. Roman occupation, Hellenistic influence, the corrupt Jerusalem priesthood, all of this would be swept away. Only those who maintained the boundaries would survive. This interpretation required belief in imminent apocalyptic intervention. If God was not going to act soon, then separatism was simply fanaticism, cutting oneself off from culture for no purpose. But if God was about to act, then separatism was survival strategy, the only rational response to a doomed world. The flood narrative then served as both memory and prophecy, memory of past judgment, prophecy of future judgment. It explained why the world was broken, because boundaries had been violated. It promised that the world would be fixed, because God would intervene, and it prescribed appropriate response, maintain boundaries, reject contamination, wait for the purging flood to come. The Book of 1 Enoch was never included in the Jewish biblical canon. The Book of Jubilees, which retells the Watcher story, was excluded. The Book of Giants disappeared entirely except in fragmentary form. By the time the rabbis consolidated the Hebrew Bible in the centuries after the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE, the explicit Watcher narrative had been effectively removed from authoritative Jewish scripture. Only Genesis 6:1-4 remained, 4 ambiguous verses that could be read supernaturally or naturalistically, as describing angels or simply powerful men, and Numbers 13:33, a single verse mentioning Nephilim without explaining what they were. These traces survived because they were embedded in narratives that had to be included, the flood story and the wilderness wandering. But the interpretive tradition that made sense of these verses was suppressed. Why? The rabbis who shaped Second Temple and later Rabbinic Judaism faced multiple pressures. After 70 CE, with the temple destroyed and Jews scattered, preserving communal identity became paramount. This required clearly defined boundaries between Jew and Gentile, between holy and profane, between acceptable and forbidden doctrine. The Watcher narrative created problems for boundary maintenance. First, it gave too much agency to angels. If angels could rebel, could desire, could make choices contrary to divine will, then they were not simply messengers but independent beings with their own wills. This raised uncomfortable questions about divine sovereignty. If God's own agents could rebel, how secure was God's control over creation? Second, the narrative placed blame for human corruption outside humanity. If the problem was angelic intervention, then humans were victims, not culprits. This undercut the rabbinic emphasis on human moral responsibility. If the source of evil was external contamination rather than human choice, then repentance and obedience to Torah might be insufficient remedies. Third, the elaborate angelology in Enochic literature risked angel worship. If angels had names, personalities and roles, people might pray to them, make offerings to them, seek their intervention. This was precisely what happened in some mystical Jewish circles. The Hekkelot literature from late antiquity describes mystics attempting to ascend through the heavenly palaces, encountering named angels, learning secret knowledge. The rabbis viewed this as dangerous, a distraction from exclusive worship of God. Fourth, the Watcher narrative was politically inconvenient. Apocalyptic movements, groups expecting imminent divine intervention to destroy the current world order, were dangerous to a community trying to survive within Roman and later Christian empires. Better to emphasize accommodation, obedience to civil authorities, focus on Torah study and family life. Apocalyptic hopes could lead to messianic uprisings, which inevitably led to brutal suppression. The Bar Kokhba revolt, 132 to 135 CE, was the last major Jewish apocalyptic uprising against Rome. After its catastrophic failure, rabbinic authorities doubled down on non-apocalyptic Judaism. The Mishnah, compiled around 200 CE, focuses on detailed legal discussions of everyday life, with almost no apocalyptic or angelological content. The message was clear. Stop waiting for divine intervention. Focus on living faithfully in the present. In this context, the Watcher narrative was a liability. It fed apocalyptic expectations. It complicated theology. It potentially enabled angel worship. Better to minimize it, reinterpret it, let it fade from memory. The Targums, Aramaic translations and paraphrases of the Hebrew Bible used in synagogues, show the reinterpretation in action. Genesis 6:2 in Hebrew reads, "The sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took wives." Targum Onkelos renders this, "The sons of the great saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took wives." Sons of God become sons of the great. Powerful humans, not angels. Targum Pseudo-Jonathan is even more explicit. The sons of the judges saw that the daughters of men were beautiful. This interpretation removes any supernatural element. The story becomes simply about social injustice, powerful men abusing their authority to take multiple wives. Rabbinic commentary followed suit. The Talmud rarely mentions the Watchers, and when it does, it's usually to correct popular misunderstandings. Genesis Rabbah, a midrashic commentary compiled around the 5th century CE, acknowledges the angelic interpretation but prefers the naturalistic reading. The dominant rabbinic view became Genesis 6:1-4, describes human sin, not angelic rebellion, but the text survived. Once Enoch was preserved in Ethiopia, where it was included in the biblical canon of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. Why Ethiopia? Probably because Ethiopian Christianity developed in relative isolation from the theological controversies that shaped Western Christianity and Rabbinic Judaism. When missionaries brought scripture to Ethiopia in the 4th century CE, they brought the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible that included books later deemed apocryphal. 1 Enoch was part of the package and remained part of the Ethiopian Bible even after other churches rejected it. Fragmentary translations of 1 Enoch also survived in Greek and Latin, preserved by Christian writers who quoted it even after it was no longer considered canonical. Church fathers like Tertullian, 2nd–3rd century CE, and Athenagoras, 2nd century CE, treated 1 Enoch as authoritative, using it to explain the origin of demons and to warn against sexual immorality. But as Christianity developed its doctrine of angels, the Watcher narrative became problematic for similar reasons it had been problematic for rabbis. Augustine, 4th–5th century CE, argued that angels, being pure intellects without bodies, could not physically mate with humans. The sons of God in Genesis 6 must therefore mean descendants of Seth, Adam's righteous son, and the daughters of men must mean descendants of Cain. The narrative became about the righteous line intermarrying with the wicked line, still a boundary violation, but a human one. This interpretation became dominant in Western Christianity. Medieval and Reformation theologians rarely defended the angelic reading. It survived primarily in folk tradition, artistic depictions, and among groups considered heretical by mainstream churches. The Qumran scrolls were sealed in caves around 68 CE, just before the Romans destroyed the community. For nearly 2,000 years the scrolls lay hidden. 7 copies of 1 Enoch, fragments of the Book of Giants, and dozens of other texts that preserved the Watcher tradition in its original Jewish context. When the scrolls were discovered in Mabud 7, the first fragments were brought to scholars in Jerusalem. Early analysis focused on biblical texts, the Isaiah scroll, the Psalm scroll, but as more fragments were studied, the significance of the non-biblical material became clear. Here, in 1st century Jewish texts, was the Watcher narrative in its full supernatural reading, treated as authoritative, copied multiple times, integrated into the community's understanding of history and eschatology. The discovery forced a reconsideration of early Judaism. Scholars had assumed that apocalyptic angelological Judaism was marginal, a fringe movement that had little influence on mainstream Jewish thought. The Dead Sea Scrolls proved otherwise. Apocalyptic belief was widespread, serious, and deeply integrated into Second Temple Jewish theology. More importantly, the scrolls showed that the marginal texts, 1 Enoch, Jubilees, the Book of Giants, were not late Hellenistic inventions but early Jewish compositions, predating the fixing of the biblical canon. They represented alternative Jewish traditions that were eventually suppressed but had once been vibrant and influential. This meant that the Judaism that emerged after 70 CE, rabbinic, non-apocalyptic, focused on Torah rather than angels, was not the inevitable development of biblical religion, but one option among several. The apocalyptic Judaism of Qumran, centered on texts like 1 Enoch, was equally authentic, equally rooted in ancient tradition. It just lost the political struggle for survival. The silence after the flood, the suppression of the Watcher narrative, was not natural forgetting. It was active erasure, motivated by theological and political considerations. The story was too dangerous, too disruptive, too likely to lead communities in directions authorities couldn't control. But erasure was never complete. The story survived in fragments, in illusions, in folk memory. It survived because it answered questions that refused to go away. Where does evil come from? Why is the world broken? What happens when boundaries meant to be firm become permeable? Can the divine and human meet? And if they do, is the result blessing or catastrophe? These questions outlasted the specific answers the Watcher narrative provided. They outlasted the Second Temple period, the rise of Christianity, the consolidation of Rabbinic Judaism, the medieval period, modernity itself. And when the Dead Sea Scrolls brought the Watcher narrative back into public view, it turned out the questions were still urgent, still unanswered, still demanding attention. The silence after was never true silence. It was suppressed speech, waiting to break through. If the Nephilim were destroyed in the flood, why do post-flood biblical texts continue to mention giant peoples inhabiting Canaan? The answer lies in the persistence of oral tradition and the flexibility of terminology. The Anakim appear in Numbers 13:28-33 as inhabitants of the Hebron region, described by Israelite spies as being so tall that we seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them. Deuteronomy 2:10-11 identifies several giant peoples: the Emim in Moab, the Zamzumim in Ammon, and the Rephaim in multiple locations. All are described as tall as the Anakim. These peoples were historical. They appear in Egyptian records, Mesopotamian texts, and archaeological remains. But were they literally giants? Or were they simply taller than average, or powerful enough that their memory was magnified in tradition? The Rephaim are particularly interesting. The term appears in multiple contexts in the Hebrew Bible. In some passages, Deuteronomy 2:11, Joshua 12:4, Rephaim are pre-Israelite inhabitants of Transjordan. In other passages, Isaiah 14-9, Job 26:5, Rephaim are shades of the dead, spirits in the underworld. The same word means both giants and ghosts. This dual meaning suggests a connection between the giant peoples and the dead. Perhaps the Rephaim were understood as the spirits of the antediluvian Nephilim, surviving in ghostly form after their physical bodies were destroyed. Or perhaps the term simply came to mean any liminal being, too large to be fully human, too dead to be fully alive, occupying a boundary space between categories. Archaeological sites in the Transjordan, the region east of the Jordan River, including modern Jordan, preserve structures associated with the Rephaim. The dolmens of the Golan Heights and Gilead are massive stone constructions consisting of large upright stones supporting even larger capstones. They date to the early Bronze Age, 3000 pounds 2000 BCE, and cluster in areas that biblical texts associate with the Rephaim. The dolmen's function is debated. They may have been burial chambers, though few contain skeletal remains. They may have been territorial markers, ritual structures, or astronomical alignments. Whatever their original purpose, later populations viewed them with awe. The construction techniques, moving and positioning stones weighing multiple tons without metal tools or wheeled vehicles, suggested superhuman strength. Local tradition associated the dolmens with giants. Arabic-speaking populations called them the beds of the giants, or the tables of the giants. This folk memory, persisting thousands of years after the structures were built, echoes the political tradition of pre-Israelite giants in the same regions. King Og of Bashan becomes the exemplar of these giant peoples. Deuteronomy 3:11 states, "Only Og, king of Bashan, was left of the remnant of the Rephaim. His bed was made of iron, and was more than 9 cubits long and 4 cubits wide." A cubit was approximately 18 inches, making the bed roughly 13 feet long and 6 feet wide. The text adds, as if offering proof, "Is it not in Rabbath of the Ammonites?" meaning the bed could be inspected, was a real object on public display. Was Og actually a giant? Or was his bed a sarcophagus, a ritual platform, or a monument misidentified by later tradition? The Hebrew word translated bed, erez, can also mean bier or couch. If it was a funerary monument rather than a functional bed, Its size might reflect artistic convention or symbolic importance rather than the actual size of the occupant. But the tradition persisted. Og was the last of the giants. After his defeat by the Israelites, the Rephaim no longer ruled in Bashan. The connection to the Nephilim was implicit. The pre-flood giants destroyed, the post-flood giants defeated. The age of hybrids was over. The world now belonged to normal humans. Greek historians preserved parallel traditions about unusually tall peoples in the Levant. Herodotus, 5th century BCE, mentions no such giants, but later Hellenistic writers do. The gigantes of Greek mythology, children of Gaia and Uranus who warred against the Olympian gods, were sometimes located geographically in Syria or Phoenicia. This may reflect Greek encounters with local traditions about pre-Hellenic giants. Egyptian records provide no direct confirmation, but do record military encounters with peoples from Canaan and the Transjordan. The Amarna letters, 14th century BCE, mention the Apiru, possibly related to the term Hebrew, as troublesome groups in the hill country, but they are described as bandits and rebels, not as giants. The most probable explanation is that giant functioned as a category for otherness. The pre-Israelite inhabitants of Canaan, Canaanites, Amorites, Hittites, Perizzites, Hivites, Jebusites, were remembered as giants not necessarily because they were taller on average, but because they were defeated enemies, former occupants of land now claimed by Israel. Making them giants made Israel's conquest more impressive and justified displacing them as removing monsters from the land, but this rationalization doesn't fully account for the specific details, the beds, the dolmens, the persistent association of certain regions and names with extraordinary size. Something in the physical landscape and cultural memory of the Transjordan sustained belief in giants long after the people themselves had been assimilated or displaced. One possibility is that the Transjordan was a frontier zone, less integrated into Israelite cultural memory, allowing older traditions to persist. Another is that the region's geological features, basalt boulder fields, volcanic cones, massive stone structures, created an atmosphere of otherworldliness that sustained beliefs in non-human builders. The Book of Enoch addresses the survival question directly. According to 1 Enoch 15-16, when the Nephilim died, whether in the flood or through mutual violence, their spirits became demons, evil spirits that wander the earth, leading humans astray, causing illness, provoking violence. This solved the theological problem. The Nephilim's physical bodies were destroyed, but their spirits remained, continuing to corrupt the world. This demonology became foundational for Second Temple Judaism and early Christianity. Demons were not fallen angels. The angels themselves were imprisoned. Demons were the disembodied spirits of angel-human hybrids, entities that should not have existed, whose ontologically impossible nature made them permanently harmful. This interpretation appears in Jubilees, in the Testament of Solomon, and in various early Christian texts. It explained the ongoing presence of evil in a world that God had supposedly purged with the flood. The flood destroyed bodies but not spirits. The corruption continued, just in different form. Greek mythology, meanwhile, celebrated its hybrids. Heroes like Heracles, Perseus, and Achilles were sons of gods and mortal women. They were not destroyed but honoured, worshipped, integrated into civic identity. Cities claimed them as founders. Aristocratic families claimed descent from them. The contrast with Jewish tradition is stark. In Greek thought, divine human hybrids were blessings, evidence that gods cared about humans, that the barrier between divine and mortal was crossable, that extraordinary individuals could achieve godlike status through heroic deeds. In Jewish thought, divine human hybrids were curses, evidence of cosmic disorder, proof that boundaries had been violated, threats that had to be eliminated. The few heroes in Jewish tradition, David, Samson, Gideon, were fully human, distinguished by divine favour rather than mixed parentage. This difference reflects fundamentally different theologies. Greek religion was polytheistic, with gods who competed, loved, fought, and interfered in human affairs. Human-divine interaction was normal, expected, desirable. Jewish religion was monotheistic, with a God who transcended creation and demanded exclusive worship. Human-divine interaction had to be mediated, regulated, kept within strict boundaries. The survival of giant traditions, whether as folk memory, literary motif, or demonological explanation, shows the persistent human need to account for the uncanny, the exceptional, the boundary-breaking. Every culture has figures who exceed normal human limits. The question is how to interpret them, as blessings or threats, as evidence of divine favour or divine judgment, as aspirations or warnings. Jewish tradition chose warning. The giants were not heroes but monsters. Their defeat was cause for celebration, not mourning. Their memory served as reminder. Do not cross the boundaries. Do not mix what should remain separate. Do not repeat the error that brought the flood. But even in warning, the tradition preserved fascination. The giants were terrible, but they were also remarkable. They possessed knowledge and power beyond ordinary humans. They came from somewhere else, bore witness to another possibility, suggested that the world was stranger and more dangerous than daily life revealed. The survivors of the old stories were not the Nephilim themselves, but the memory of them. The sense that once boundaries had been crossed, the world had been different, and that difference had required catastrophic divine intervention to correct. That memory shaped how Jewish communities understood their own boundaries, their own fears of contamination, their own hopes for purification. The giants were gone, but the danger they represented remained always present. The danger of mixing, of forgetting distinctions, of loving what should be other, of bringing down what should stay above. By the time Rome conquered Judea in 63 BCE, Jewish beliefs about angels, demons, and giants had evolved considerably from their ancient Near Eastern origins. Yet these beliefs remained foreign, often incomprehensible or laughable to Roman observers. Josephus, the first-century Jewish historian who wrote for Roman audiences, handled the Watcher tradition carefully. In his massive work Jewish Antiquities, written in Greek for a Roman readership, Josephus recounts the Genesis 6 narrative but frames it diplomatically. Many angels of God accompanied women and begat sons that proved unjust and despisers of all that was good on account of the confidence they had in their own strength. For the tradition is that these men did what resembled the acts of those whom the Grecians called giants. Notice the hedging. Josephus doesn't claim personal belief in angel-human unions. He attributes the tradition to others, the tradition is, and immediately compares it to Greek mythology, making it comprehensible to his audience. He's translating Jewish belief into terms Romans can understand, even if they don't accept it. Josephus was writing after the catastrophic Jewish revolt against Rome, 66-70 CE, that ended with Jerusalem's destruction. His task was to explain Jewish culture to Romans in ways that made Jews seem rational, ancient, philosophically sophisticated, not as superstitious fanatics whose peculiar beliefs had led to rebellion. Roman intellectuals in the 1st century CE had complex attitudes towards supernatural beliefs. On one hand, official Roman religion included divination, augury, and belief in omens. The Roman Senate consulted the Sibylline books before major decisions. Generals took auspices before battle. Household religion included lares and penates, protective spirits of the home. On the other hand, educated Romans often expressed skepticism about literal belief in myths. Cicero, 1st century BCE, mocked superstition while defending traditional religious practice as politically necessary. Lucretius, 1st century BCE, wrote an entire philosophical poem, De Rerum Natura, arguing that gods do not intervene in human affairs and that fear of divine punishment is irrational. Into this environment came early Christian missionaries proclaiming beliefs that seemed to Romans like Jewish superstition amplified. Angels had rebelled. Demons were real and active. A man named Jesus had been executed but rose from the dead and would return to judge the living and the dead. The world as currently constituted would be destroyed and remade. Roman authorities tolerated Judaism as an ancient ethnic religion, but viewed Christianity as a dangerous cult, not because of its theology per se, but because Christians refused to participate in civic religion, claimed exclusive truth, and showed more loyalty to their God than to Rome. Their apocalyptic beliefs made them suspect people expecting the world to end soon might not have incentive to support social order. Early Christian writers defended their beliefs by appealing to Jewish scripture, which Romans at least recognized as ancient. The Watcher narrative became useful apologetic material. If angels could rebel, then the existence of evil didn't contradict belief in an all-powerful good God. Evil came from misused free will, not God's doing but the angel's choice. Tertullian, c. 55-240 CE, a North African Christian theologian, wrote an entire treatise called On the Apparel of Women, in which he used the Watcher narrative to argue against women wearing jewelry and cosmetics. He took the 1 Enoch account literally. Those angels who fell from heaven brought knowledge of metalworking and cosmetics to humanity. Therefore, when women adorn themselves with gold and makeup, they are using arts taught by fallen angels for the purpose of seduction. For Tertullian, the Watcher story wasn't ancient mythology but living moral teaching. The forbidden knowledge taught by the rebellious angels continued to corrupt society. Christians must reject it, maintaining the boundaries that the antediluvian world had violated. Athenagoras of Athens, 2nd century CE, similarly used the Watcher narrative in his Legatio, Embassy for the Christians, written to defend Christians against charges of atheism and immorality. He explained that angels appointed to govern matter fell into desires for women and begat children who are the demons. This gave Christians a comprehensive demonology. Demons weren't gods, as pagans believed, or illusions, as some philosophers claimed, but real entities with a specific origin, the hybrid offspring of rebel angels and human women. By providing this clear origin story, Christians could explain why the world was full of temples to false gods. Those gods were actually demons, worshipped by humans who didn't know better. This made paganism not an alternative religion, but demonic deception. It allowed Christians to acknowledge the reality of supernatural experiences pagans reported, oracles, healings, visions, while attributing them to demons rather than gods. Not all early Christians accepted this interpretation. Justin Martyr, 2nd century CE, mentioned the Watcher story but didn't emphasize it. Origen, 3rd century CE, was ambivalent, sometimes accepting it, sometimes favouring allegorical readings. By the time of Augustine, 4th-5th century CE, tide had turned against the supernatural reading. Augustine devoted considerable attention to Genesis 6:1-4 in City of God. His arguments against the angelic interpretation were multiple. First, angels are incorporeal spirits and therefore cannot physically reproduce. Second, the sons of God more plausibly means descendants of Seth, Adam's righteous line, while daughters of men means descendants of Cain, the wicked line. Third, belief in angel-human hybrids was too similar to pagan mythology about gods mating with mortals and should be rejected as pagan contamination of Christian doctrine. Fourth, the whole idea was unseemly, inappropriate for sacred scripture. Augustine's interpretation became standard in Western Christianity. The medieval church taught that Genesis 6:1-4 described intermarriage between the righteous and wicked lines of humanity. Angels, being pure intellects, could not engage in sexual acts. The Nephilim were simply violent men, not hybrids. But Augustine's victory was not complete. Folk Christianity retained belief in incubi and succubi, demons that sexually assaulted humans, sometimes producing offspring. These beliefs, condemned by church authorities as superstition, nevertheless persisted throughout the medieval period. The witch trials of the early modern period, 1450 to 1750, frequently included accusations of sexual commerce with demons. The connection to the Watcher narrative was implicit. If angels had once mated with humans, then demons, the spirits of the Nephilim, might still do so. The boundaries between supernatural and human remained dangerously permeable. The Reformation brought renewed attention to Genesis 6:1-4. Some reformers, emphasizing literal biblical interpretation, revived the angelic reading. Others followed Augustine's safer interpretation. The debate never fully resolved. Meanwhile, in Jewish communities, the Watcher narrative had largely disappeared from mainstream rabbinic discourse. The Talmud rarely mentioned it. Medieval rabbinic commentaries preferred naturalistic readings of Genesis 6:1-4. But the tradition survived in Jewish mysticism, Kabbalah and Merkabah literature, where elaborate angelologies described multiple heavens named angels and ongoing angelic influence on earthly affairs. The tension between official doctrine and folk belief, between rationalized theology and popular imagination, characterized both Jewish and Christian responses to the Watcher narrative through the medieval period. Officially, the story was either rejected as mythology or reinterpreted as human history. Unofficially, it remained a powerful explanation for evil, corruption, and the presence of supernatural threats. Islamic tradition took yet another approach. The Quran does not mention the Watcher story directly, but Islamic commentators preserved versions of it in their interpretation of Quranic verses about angels. The story of Harut and Marut, two angels sent to Babylon who were tempted by a beautiful woman and fell into sin, echoes the Watcher narrative. Some Islamic scholars identified these as the same sons of God from Genesis 6, but mainstream Islamic theology, like Augustine's Christianity, rejected the idea that angels could rebel through sexual desire. Angels were created without free will, programmed to obey God. Only Iblis, Satan, refused God's command, and he was a jinn, not an angel, a different category of being created from fire rather than light. The result was a tripartite response across the three Abrahamic traditions. Judaism had largely suppressed the Watcher narrative by the medieval period, preserving it only in mystical subcultures. Christianity had reinterpreted it away from literal angel-human unions, while retaining belief in demons as real entities. Islam had incorporated echoes of the story, but firmly rejected angelic rebellion through lust. Yet all three traditions struggled with the same underlying problem the Watcher narrative had addressed. If God is all-powerful and all-good, why is the world full of evil? The Watcher story provided an answer that didn't blame God or make evil inherent to creation. Evil came from outside, from beings who chose rebellion, who violated boundaries they were meant to maintain. Without the Watcher narrative, each tradition had to develop alternative explanations. Judaism emphasized the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination present in all humans from birth, balanced by the Yetzer Hatov, the good inclination. Evil was internal to humanity, but humans had free will to choose good. Christianity emphasized original sin, the inherited corruption transmitted from Adam to all his descendants. Evil was humanity's own fault, originating in Eden's disobedience. Islam emphasized human free will and Iblis's temptation, but insisted evil had no ontological reality, only the reality of wrong choices. These alternative explanations worked theologically, but lack the narrative power of the Watcher story. They explained why humans do evil, but not why the world seems structured to produce suffering, why nature itself appears red in tooth and claw, why history shows patterns of violence and oppression beyond individual choice, why corruption seems systematic rather than merely personal. The Watcher narrative answered those harder questions. It suggested that creation itself had been damaged, contaminated by a primordial boundary violation. The structures of the world were not as God intended them. Something had gone wrong not just in human hearts, but in the fabric of reality. That's why the flood was necessary, not just to punish sin, but to reset creation itself. Without this narrative, the Odyssey became more difficult. Believers had to explain suffering and evil without recourse to cosmic corruption. They had to maintain that creation was good, humanity was fallen, and God remained sovereign, while acknowledging that the world appeared deeply, systematically broken in ways that individual, human sin couldn't fully explain. The suppression of the Watcher narrative then created as many problems as it solved. It simplified theology, reduced the risk of angel worship, removed embarrassing sexual content from sacred history, but it also removed a powerful explanatory tool, leaving believers with less robust answers to questions that refused to go away. On a spring day in 47, a young Bedouin shepherd named Mohammed Edsheb was searching for a lost goat in the cliffs northwest of the Dead Sea. He threw a stone into a cave opening and heard the sound of breaking pottery. Investigating, he found clay jars containing leather scrolls wrapped in linen. This story, repeated in countless popular accounts, is probably simplified from a more complex series of events involving multiple Bedouin, illegal antiquities trading, and deliberate misdirection of authorities. But the result was indisputable. Ancient scrolls, preserved by the dry desert climate, began appearing in antiquities markets in Jerusalem and Bethlehem. The first scroll fragments reached Professor Eliezer Sukenik of Hebrew University in late November 1947. Coincidentally, the same week the United Nations voted to partition Palestine, setting in motion the events that would create the State of Israel. Sukenik immediately recognized the scroll's antiquity and importance. Other fragments were purchased by Mar Samuel, the metropolitan of the Syrian Orthodox monastery in Jerusalem, who didn't initially understand what he had bought. In early 48, with Jerusalem under siege during the Arab-Israeli War, Mar Samuel contacted scholars at the American Schools of Oriental Research. John Trevor photographed the Isaiah scroll and sent images to William F. Albright at Johns Hopkins University. Albright's response, received by telegram, was definitive. "My heartiest congratulations on the greatest manuscript discovery of modern times." Thus began the most important archaeological discovery of the 20th century, and one of the most complicated, involving smuggling, forgery accusations, political conflict, scholarly rivalries, and decades of delayed publication. Between 1947 and 1956, 11 caves in the vicinity of Qumran yielded approximately 950 scrolls and scroll fragments representing about 500 different texts. Cave 4 alone, discovered by Bedouin in September 1952, produced fragments from more than 500 manuscripts. The finds revolutionized understanding of Second Temple Judaism, textual development of the Hebrew Bible, and the religious context of early Christianity. Among the biblical manuscripts were the oldest known copies of every book of the Hebrew Bible except Esther, some 1,000 years older than previously known versions. The Isaiah scroll from Cave 1, dated to around 125 BCE, was virtually complete and showed remarkable consistency with the medieval Masoretic text, demonstrating careful transmission over a millennium. But for scholars of early Jewish apocalypticism, the most significant discoveries were the non-biblical texts, documents that had been lost, suppressed, or known only from late translations. These included the community rule describing the organization and beliefs of the Qumran community, the war scroll detailing an eschatological final battle between the sons of light and sons of darkness, the thanksgiving, hymns, prayers and psalms not found in the biblical Psalter, the Damascus document, previously known from medieval copies found in a Cairo synagogue, the temple scroll describing an idolized temple larger than Solomon's or Herod's, the Genesis Apocryphon, retelling and expanding Genesis stories, multiple copies of the Book of Jubilees, retelling Genesis and Exodus with additional legal and clerical material, and crucially 7 manuscripts of 1 Enoch, or fragments thereof, plus fragments of the Book of Giants. The Enochic materials were found primarily in Cave 4. They were in Aramaic, the common language of Jews in the Persian and Hellenistic periods. They dated from the 3rd century BCE to the 1st century CE, meaning they were copied over a span of 300 years. This was not a marginal text preserved by accident. This was a work the community considered essential, important enough to copy repeatedly across generations. When J.T. Milik, a Polish Catholic priest and Dead Sea Scrolls scholar, was assigned to study and publish the Aramaic fragments from Cave 4, he found himself reconstructing texts that had been lost to scholarship for nearly 2,000 years. Using fragments from multiple manuscripts, some containing only a few letters, he pieced together portions of 1 Enoch and identified fragments of the Book of Giants, previously known only from Manichaean sources in Middle Persian and other Central Asian languages. Milik's work on the Enochic materials took decades. His preliminary edition of the Aramaic Enoch fragments wasn't published until 1906, and fuller critical editions took even longer. The delays frustrated scholars eager to access the materials and fed conspiracy theories about the Catholic Church suppressing documents that contradicted Orthodox Christianity. In reality, the delays reflected the immense difficulty of the work. Imagine reconstructing a 200-page book from scraps, some the size of postage stamps with text faded and damaged, written in a script style that takes expertise to read, in a language whose grammar and vocabulary are imperfectly understood, with no complete original to check against. Now imagine doing this for dozens of different texts simultaneously. That was Milik's task. The Enochic fragments revealed several crucial facts. First, 1 Enoch as preserved in Ethiopic Ge'ez was substantially accurate. The Aramaic fragments confirm that the Ethiopic translators had worked from reliable Hebrew-Aramaic sources and had transmitted the text faithfully. This validated using the Ethiopic version for scholarly study even when original language sources were fragmentary. Second, the Book of the Watchers, 1 Enoch 136, was the oldest section, probably dating to the 3rd century BCE. The Aramaic fragments of this section were paleographically dated to around 200 BCE, meaning the composition was earlier still. Third, the Book of Parables, 1 Enoch 3771, which contains the most developed messianic material and has been central to debates about Jewish messianism's influence on Christianity, was not found at Qumran. This absence is striking and raises questions about whether the Parables section was a later addition not known to the Qumran community, or simply not preserved in the caves. Fourth, the Book of Giants was a separate work, not part of 1 Enoch, and was known at Qumran in multiple copies. This meant the Watcher mythology spawned an entire literature, with different authors expanding the narrative in different directions. The Book of Giants fragments, though frustratingly incomplete, preserved remarkable details. Fragment 4Q531 contains part of a dream vision experienced by Ohania, one of the Nephilim. I saw in my vision, behold, in my dream, the heaven was overthrown, and fire was poured out upon the mountain. Then they brought to me a tablet, and the entire tablet was written, except 3 names, and the waters of the flood were about to come upon the entire earth. The text breaks off, but the narrative is clear. The Nephilim know they're doomed. They see the coming destruction in dreams and seek interpretation from Enoch, the human sage who has access to heavenly knowledge. The tragedy of the giants, beings who didn't choose their own birth, who are nevertheless marked for destruction, comes through even in fragments. Another fragment, Forkyverk, preserves a speech by one of the giants, possibly addressing his brothers. All the monsters that remember everything that has been said and let them see that they were powerful, and let them remember all the violence, all that they did upon the earth. The text seems to be a confession, an acknowledgement of guilt, a recognition that the giants' violence justified their coming destruction. These are not mindless monsters, but self-aware beings grappling with their nature and fate. The publication of these fragments transformed scholarly understanding of Second Temple Judaism. Previously, scholars had viewed apocalyptic Judaism, with its elaborate angelology, demonology, and eschatology, as a marginal phenomenon, perhaps influenced by Persian dualism, certainly peripheral to mainstream Jewish thought. The Dead Sea Scrolls proved this view wrong. Apocalyptic belief was central, not marginal. The Qumran community, which may have numbered only a few hundred members at its peak, was not isolated in its beliefs. Similar communities existed throughout Judea. The apocalyptic worldview, expecting imminent divine intervention, elaborate cosmology, belief in ongoing angelic and demonic activity, was widespread. This meant that when Jesus appeared in first-century Palestine teaching about the kingdom of God, demons, angels, and coming judgment, he was not introducing foreign ideas. He was speaking the language of his time, drawing on conceptual frameworks that Palestinian Jews would have recognized. Whether or not Jesus knew the written text of Feed Enoch, which is possible, he could read and had studied scripture, he certainly knew the traditions it represented. Similarly, when Paul wrote about principalities and powers, rulers of this present darkness, and spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places, Ephesians chapter 6:12, he was not inventing a new demonology. He was using standard Second Temple Jewish categories, derived ultimately from the Watcher tradition. The cosmic conflict between good and evil, with humans caught in the middle but destined for victory through divine intervention, was the basic structure of apocalyptic thought, and it came directly from the narrative of the Watcher's rebellion and coming judgment. The rediscovery of the Enochic literature also explained puzzles in the New Testament. Jude font 15 quotes 1 Enoch 1:9 directly. Behold, the Lord came with 10,000s of his holy ones to execute judgment on all and to convict all the ungodly. For centuries, scholars had noted that this passage appeared nowhere in the Hebrew Bible. Now they knew Jude was quoting from Worst Enoch, treating it as authoritative scripture. Jude 6 refers to angels who did not keep their own position, but left their proper dwelling, who are kept in eternal chains in deepest darkness for the judgment of the great day. This is a clear reference to the Watchers imprisoned until final judgment, a narrative found in Bar Enoch but not in the canonical Hebrew Bible. 2 Peter 2:4 says, "God did not spare the angels when they sinned, but cast them into hell and committed them to chains of deepest darkness." Again, this reflects 1 Enoch's narrative rather than the Genesis 6:1-4 text, which says nothing about angels being imprisoned. These New Testament passages made sense only in light of Enochic tradition. The apostolic authors knew this literature, treated it as authoritative, and expected their audiences to recognize the references. This meant that first-century Christianity emerged from a Jewish milieu deeply shaped by apocalyptic Enochic thought. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church had been right all along. 1 Enoch was ancient Jewish scripture, properly included in the Christian biblical canon. Its exclusion from Western canons reflected later theological developments, not its original status. The discoveries at Qumran didn't just add texts to libraries, they forced a reconceptualization of early Judaism and Christianity. The religions that emerged from Second Temple Judaism, Rabbinic Judaism and Christianity both represented selections from a broader menu of options. They emphasized certain texts, suppressed others, and developed in directions that were not inevitable but contingent. In particular, both traditions moved away from the elaborate cosmological speculation characteristic of texts like 1 Enoch. They emphasized human moral responsibility over cosmic conflict, ethical behavior over esoteric knowledge, community life over apocalyptic expectation. These were practical developments, enabling religious communities to survive long-term in societies that were not about to end. But something was lost. The sense of living in a cosmos in crisis, where boundaries between heaven and earth were permeable and dangerous, where human history was caught up in larger conflicts beyond human control. This dramatic vision faded. Religion became more manageable, more domestic, more focused on everyday life and less on ultimate cosmic stakes. The rediscovery of the Enochic literature in the Dead Sea Scrolls brought that vision back into view. It showed what Jewish and Christian theology looked like before it was domesticated, before it was made safe for empire. It preserved a moment when religion was still wild, still apocalyptic, still structured around the memory of angels who fell in love with humans and brought the world to the edge of destruction. Why do cultures create stories about beings who violate fundamental boundaries? The question applies not just to the Watcher narrative, but to a widespread pattern in human mythology. Figures who are part human, part other. Mermaids, centaurs, werewolves, vampires, changelings, demons in human form. Anthropologists studying boundary violation myths identify several psychological and social functions these stories serve. Projection of anxiety about outsiders. Every society defines itself against others, us versus them, inside versus outside. But borders are never perfectly sealed. Outsiders marry in. Trade brings foreign goods and ideas. Conquest imposes foreign rulers. Boundary-crossing beings embody the anxiety this produces. The centaur, half human, half horse, represents the nomadic horseman who threatened Greek city-states. The werewolf represents the neighbour who seems normal, but transforms into something deadly. The Nephilim represent the offspring of unions that violate ethnic or social boundaries. Expression of ambivalence about mixing. Hybrid beings are often portrayed as both powerful and monstrous. They possess advantages of both natures, but belong fully to neither. This reflects real experiences of cultural mixing. Children of mixed marriages may face identity conflicts, discrimination from both parent groups, but also possess linguistic and cultural fluencies unavailable to those of single heritage. The hybrid is simultaneously threat and opportunity, externalization of internal conflict. The human psyche contains contradictions, reason and passion, spirit and flesh, social obligation and individual desire. Hybrid beings can represent these internal divisions projected outward. The human-angel hybrid represents the tension between earthly limitation and spiritual aspiration. The human-animal hybrid represents the tension between civilization and instinct. Explanation for exceptional individuals. In every society, some individuals display abilities far beyond the norm. Extraordinary strength, intelligence, beauty, leadership. How to explain this? Heredity? Luck? Divine favor? One answer, mixed ancestry. The exceptional individual is literally not fully human. This explanation appears across cultures. Greek heroes descended from gods, Irish kings descended from the Tuatha De Danann, Tibetan nobility descended from monkeys and rock ogresses, Germanic royalty descended from elves or Aesir. The Watcher narrative deploys all these functions. The Watchers are outsiders, literally from outside the world. The Nephilim are mixed offspring, possessing both superhuman power and monstrous appetites. They represent the anxiety ancient Israelites felt about intermarriage with Canaanites, about cultural contamination by Mesopotamian and later Hellenistic influences, about the corruption of pure covenant identity through mixing with the nations. Archaeological evidence shows that ancient Israel was not ethnically homogeneous. Despite biblical narratives of conquest and genocide, Canaanite culture persisted within Israel. Pottery styles, house architecture, diet and burial practices show continuity from Canaanite to Israelite cultures. The people who became Israel were partly indigenous Canaanites who adopted a new religious identity, partly pastoral nomads from the desert fringe, partly refugees from collapsed city-states. This mixed origin created anxiety. Deuteronomy repeatedly commands, "You shall not intermarry with them, giving your daughters to their sons, or taking their daughters for your sons, for that would turn away your descendants from following me, to serve other gods." Deuteronomy 7:3-4. Ezra 9-10 describes a crisis in post-exilic Jerusalem when it's discovered that men, including priests and Levites, have married foreign women. Ezra's solution: forced divorce, expulsion of foreign wives and their children. This is not merely xenophobia, it reflects genuine concern about religious and cultural survival. A small community surrounded by larger, more powerful cultures faces constant pressure to assimilate. Intermarriage facilitates assimilation. Children learn their mother's language and religion as well as their father's. Within a few generations, distinct identity can dissolve. The Watcher narrative dramatizes this danger. The daughters of men are not demonized. They are described as beautiful, desirable, but union with them produces offspring who threaten existence itself. The message is clear. No matter how attractive the other, no matter how consensual the relationship, the result is catastrophe. This message served Second Temple Jewish communities facing Hellenization. Greek culture was attractive, sophisticated, cosmopolitan, offering access to wider economic and intellectual worlds. Greek gymnasiums in Jerusalem provided networking opportunities. Greek philosophy offered rational ways to understand the world. Greek language opened access to libraries and scholarship. But Greek culture also required participation in civic religion, threatened Sabbath observance, made dietary laws appear barbaric, and treated circumcision as mutilation. For Jews trying to maintain covenant identity, Hellenization was an existential threat. Within a generation or two, descendants might be indistinguishable from Gentiles. The Watcher narrative said, "This has happened before. The world became so mixed, so corrupted, that God destroyed it. Only those who maintained boundaries survived." The lesson for the present was obvious. Maintain boundaries now or face destruction. Iron Age burial practices in the ancient Near East provide physical evidence of boundary anxiety. Cemeteries often show clear separation between groups, with different pottery types, jewelry styles, body positions, and grave goods marking ethnic or social distinctions. When mixed burials appear, someone buried with grave goods from multiple cultural traditions, it often indicates social change, conquest, or intermarriage. At Megiddo, a major city in northern Israel, burials from the Late Bronze Age, before Israel's emergence, and Iron Age I's early Israel show continuity in some respects and sharp breaks in others. Pig bones, common in Canaanite contexts, virtually disappear from Israelite settlements, a dietary boundary that marks religious identity. But pottery styles show gradual evolution rather than replacement, suggesting population continuity. This archaeological reality, Israelite culture emerging from within Canaanite culture rather than conquering it from outside, conflicts with biblical narratives of conquest. It suggests that Israelite was less an ethnic category than a religious and social one. To be Israelite meant worshipping YHWH, observing certain laws, and identifying with a particular narrative history. But it didn't mean having different ancestors than Canaanites. The Watcher narrative addresses this uncomfortable reality by externalizing the threat. The problem isn't that Israelites are partly Canaanite by ancestry. The problem is that in the distant past, boundaries were violated by beings from outside creation, and the world became corrupted. Maintaining boundaries now isn't ethnic chauvinism, it's cosmic necessity, preventing a return to the pre-flood corruption. This mythological move, projecting social anxiety onto cosmic drama, appears in cultures worldwide. When a society feels threatened by mixing, it generates stories about monstrous hybrids. When social boundaries are secure, hybrid figures can be celebrated as bridges between worlds. The difference depends on context. In periods of security and expansion, boundary crossing as opportunity, Roman citizenship expanded to incorporate diverse peoples. Greek culture spread through Alexander's empire, mixing with local traditions to create Hellenistic synthesis. These periods produced art celebrating hybrids, mosaics of centaurs, paintings of Olympian gods mixing with mortals. In periods of threat and contraction, boundary crossing is danger. Empires fall when barbarians cross borders. Languages die when speakers marry outside the group. Religions dissolve when converts become rare and apostates common. These periods produce stories of deadly hybrids, vampires who infiltrate communities, changelings who replace human children, demons in human form. The Watcher narrative emerged in the latter context. Small communities trying to survive as minorities in empires that didn't share their values. For such communities, boundary maintenance wasn't optional, it was survival strategy. But the narrative also reveals ambivalence. The Watchers are not depicted as evil initially. They are watchers, beings who became too interested in what they watched, who came to care about humans, who fell in love. There's tragedy in this, not just villainy. They crossed boundaries from desire, not malice, and the women they married weren't victims, they were participants, perhaps willing, perhaps eager. The offspring too are tragic figures. The Book of Giants portrays Nephilim, who know they're doomed, who dream of destruction, who seek wisdom about their fate. They didn't choose to be born. They're victims of their father's transgression. Yet they must be destroyed because their existence violates cosmic order. This tragic dimension suggests the narrative encodes genuine grief about what boundary maintenance costs. To preserve identity, communities must reject relationships that cross boundaries. They must divorce foreign wives, Ezra 10. They must refuse to eat with Gentiles, Galatians 2. They must let children of mixed marriages be cut off. Jubilees 37:17 prescribes death penalty for intermarriage. These are painful choices, destroying real relationships in service of abstract principles. The Watcher narrative justifies the pain by cosmic necessity. Look what happens when boundaries aren't maintained. The world ends. Everything is lost. Better to endure the grief of separation than the catastrophe of mixing. But it acknowledges the grief. The Watchers loved. The women loved. Children were born, and all of it had to be destroyed. The flood doesn't erase only wickedness. It erases love, relationship, families. The narrative's emotional power comes from this recognition. Even legitimate love, even consensual relationship, even genuine connection can threaten existence if it crosses boundaries meant to remain inviolate. Modern readers often struggle with this message. Contemporary ethics valorizes boundary crossing, interfaith marriage, interracial relationship, cultural exchange, cosmopolitanism. We celebrate hybridity as enrichment. We view rigid boundaries as prejudice. But for ancient communities without modern technology, mass communication, or political stability, the choice was stark. Maintain boundaries and survive as a distinct people, or allow mixing and dissolve. There was no third option. The Watcher narrative encodes this zero-sum reality in cosmic terms: mixing equals death. Whether that ancient necessity should inform modern ethics is debatable. But understanding the narrative requires understanding the context. These were communities fighting for survival, using mythology to reinforce behaviours that seemed existentially necessary. The stories about forbidden beings weren't irrational superstition. They were rational tools for maintaining group cohesion in the face of overwhelming pressure to assimilate. Ancient peoples had theories about heredity, though not modern genetics. They observed that children resembled parents, that traits like height, strength, hair colour, and temperament seemed to run in families, that livestock could be selectively bred for desired characteristics. From these observations, they developed concepts of bloodlines, inheritance, and the transmission of qualities from parents to offspring. But ancient heredity theories went beyond physical traits. They believed that moral qualities, intellectual capacities, even curses and blessings could be inherited. The sins of fathers could be visited upon children to the third and fourth generation, Exodus 20:5. Royal blood conferred the right to rule. Priestly descent enabled temple service. Noble birth implied noble character. Slave birth implied servile nature. These beliefs had profound social consequences. They justified aristocracy, slavery, ethnic hierarchies, and caste systems. They explained why some families seemed blessed and others cursed across generations. They provided a conceptual framework for understanding inheritance that went far beyond observable biology into the realm of essence, nature, and destiny. The Watcher narrative intervened in these beliefs by introducing the ultimate breeding anxiety. What happens when different kinds of beings interbreed? If humans marry humans, children are human. If dogs breed with dogs, puppies are dogs. Categories remain stable. But if angels, beings of a fundamentally different nature, breed with humans, what are the offspring? The answer, according to the narrative, is Nephilim, beings whose mixed nature makes them incompatible with ordered existence. They're too large, too strong, too hungry, too violent. Their hybrid nature produces hybrid characteristics, and none of it fits within creation's designed parameters. This suggests an ancient understanding that mixing radically different types produces unstable, dangerous results. The belief wasn't entirely unfounded. Ancient peoples observed hybrid vigour in some cases. Mules, horse-donkey hybrids, were stronger than either parent species, but they also observed that mules were sterile, unable to reproduce. The hybrid was powerful, but dead-ended, unable to continue its line. Similarly, they may have observed that crossing very different sheep breeds or cattle breeds could produce offspring with health problems, unusual sizes, or temperamental difficulties. Without modern genetics to explain these observations, they developed a theory. Kinds should reproduce with kinds. Crossing kinds produces monsters or fails entirely. This theory extended to humans. Israelites should marry Israelites. Greeks should marry Greeks. Nobles should marry nobles. The enslaved should marry the enslaved. Cross these boundaries and you risked producing offspring whose nature was uncertain, whose loyalties would be divided, whose characteristics might be unpredictable. The scientific basis for these beliefs was nil, but the social utility was significant. Aristocracies maintained power by restricting marriage to within their class. Ethnic groups maintained identity by restricting marriage to within the group. Religious communities maintained boundaries by forbidding intermarriage with outsiders. The Watcher narrative provided ultimate justification. Even angels and humans cannot successfully interbreed. The attempt produces beings so dangerous that God must destroy the world to eliminate them. If even this ultimate boundary cannot be safely crossed, how much more must human boundaries be maintained? Greek and Roman philosophers developed theories of heredity that influenced later European thought. Aristotle, 4th century BCE, proposed that males provided form, the essential nature of the offspring, while females provided matter, the physical substrate. This made patrilineal descent theoretically more important than matrilineal, since fathers transmitted essence, while mothers merely provided raw material. Pythagoras, 6th century BCE, reportedly taught that exceptionally tall individuals were descendants of heroes or demigods, humans who had divine ancestry in their bloodline. This explained unusual characteristics as the lingering effect of ancient boundary crossings. The belief persisted into the Roman period, when families claimed descent from gods or heroes as legitimization of their status. Medieval European aristocracies similarly claimed descent from legendary figures, Trojan heroes, biblical patriarchs, sometimes even explicitly supernatural beings. The Merovingian dynasty of the Franks claimed descent from a sea monster that impregnated their founder's mother. Various noble houses claimed descent from elves, fairies, or divine figures. These weren't mere legends, they were genealogical claims taken seriously, used to justify political authority. The persistence of such beliefs into the modern period is remarkable. As late as the 19th century, racial theorists argued that different human races had different origins, perhaps from different species or even different acts of creation. These pseudo-scientific theories justified slavery, colonialism, and genocide by claiming that racial others weren't fully human or were inherently inferior due to their ancestral origin. The Holocaust was predicated partly on the beliefs about blood contamination, the idea that Jewish ancestry transmitted inherent characteristics that polluted Aryan bloodlines. The Nuremberg laws prohibited intermarriage not as a matter of preference, but as biological necessity to prevent racial corruption. This was the Watcher narrative inverted. Instead of angels contaminating humanity, Jews were cast as contaminants threatening Aryan purity. The horrors of 20th century racial ideology demonstrate where ancient anxieties about mixing can lead when weaponized by a modern state power. But those ancient anxieties didn't emerge from nowhere. They responded to real challenges faced by communities trying to maintain distinct identities without modern tools for doing so. No passports, no citizenship laws, no educational systems to transmit culture beyond family and village. Modern genetics has thoroughly debunked the idea that races are biologically distinct categories or that mixing produces inferior offspring. Hybrid vigor is real. Genetic diversity generally increases health and fitness. Human populations have always mixed, and contemporary humans carry ancestry from multiple ancient populations. The concept of pure bloodlines is fiction. But ancient peoples didn't have genetics. They had observation, analogy, and mythology. They observed that children resembled parents. They extrapolated that essential qualities were inherited. They created narratives to explain exceptional individuals and to justify boundaries they believed necessary for survival. The Watcher narrative was one such explanation. Giants, heroes, and individuals of exceptional ability weren't ordinary humans. They were descendants of boundary-crossing unions, carrying mixed ancestry that explained their extraordinary nature. This explanation served multiple purposes. It accounted for the exceptional without making exceptionalism randomly distributed. It reinforced boundaries by suggesting that crossing them had lasting consequences, and it provided a cosmic framework for understanding human diversity and inequality. Did ancient peoples actually believe that some individuals had angelic ancestors? Some probably did. Others probably understood the narrative metaphorically, descended from angels meaning exceptionally blessed, or possessing supernatural gifts without literal angel parentage. Still others probably rejected the idea entirely, viewing it as primitive mythology incompatible with philosophical theology. But regardless of literal belief, the concept did cultural work. It explained why some people seemed more than human. It justified treating them differently, either elevated to leadership or eliminated as threats. It made exceptional capacity comprehensible within a worldview that didn't have other explanations for dramatic variance in human ability. Modern society retains versions of this belief in subtler forms. We speak of good genes and bad genes. We attribute success to pedigree and breeding. We believe intelligence, athleticism, artistic talent, and even personality traits are substantially heritable. While modern genetics supports some of these beliefs, we often overstate genetic determination, underestimate environmental factors, and attribute to nature what is actually produced by privilege. The Watcher narrative anticipated these beliefs and made them explicit. Exceptional capacity comes from exceptional ancestry. Whether that ancestry is literally angelic or simply foreign, noble or otherwise different, the principle is the same. Mixing produces difference, and difference requires explanation and management. The narrative's warning remained. When mixing crosses certain boundaries, the result isn't merely difference but danger. The Nephilim weren't just tall or strong or intelligent, they were threats to existence itself. This encoded a belief that some boundaries, perhaps all boundaries, exist for good reason, and that treating boundary maintenance as prejudice misunderstands the stakes. Modern multiculturalism rejects this view, arguing that diversity strengthens rather than threatens communities. But the Watcher narrative insists otherwise. Diversity introduced from outside, carrying capacities and knowledge beyond community norms, destabilizes and eventually destroys. The only safety is separation. The only survival is purity. The only wisdom is maintaining the boundaries God established at creation. Whether this ancient wisdom still applies, or whether modernity has created conditions that make it obsolete, remains a matter of intense contemporary debate, one whose terms were established millennia ago in the story of angels who married humans. Stories persist across centuries because they address questions that don't go away. The Watcher narrative survived suppression, canonization debates, changing theological fashions, and the transition from oral to written to digital culture because the anxieties it addressed remained relevant. The question at the heart of the narrative is simple but profound. What happens when boundaries between radically different kinds of existence break down? Not merely social boundaries between groups, but ontological boundaries between categories of being. Can such boundaries be crossed? Should they be crossed? What are the consequences if they are? Human experience continually generates situations that raise these questions. Technology increasingly enables boundary crossings previously impossible. Genetic engineering blurs the line between species. Artificial intelligence blurs the line between human and machine. Space exploration makes human presence in environments we didn't evolve for increasingly plausible medical technology, extends life far beyond natural spans, and enables reproduction outside biological constraints. Each of these developments generates anxiety analogous to ancient anxiety about angel-human unions. We're crossing boundaries we're not sure should be crossed. We're mixing categories that were previously distinct. We're producing offspring, literal or metaphorical, whose nature is uncertain and whose place in the existing order is unclear. The Watcher narrative provides a framework for thinking about these anxieties. It says, boundary crossing is possible, attractive, productive, of remarkable results, and ultimately catastrophic if not controlled. The universe has a structure. Categories exist for reasons. Violate them at your peril. But the narrative also admits boundaries are crossable. Angels did descend. Unions did occur. Children were born. Knowledge was taught. For a time, perhaps a long time, the results seemed beneficial. Cities grew, technology advanced, civilization flourished. The catastrophe came later, when the consequences accumulated beyond management. This suggests that boundary crossing isn't immediately or obviously wrong. The wrongness emerges over time as hybrid beings reproduce, as forbidden knowledge spreads, as the structures of ordered existence erode. By the time the catastrophe is apparent, it's too late to reverse. Only total reset, the flood, can restore order. This tragic structure gives the narrative its emotional power. The Watchers didn't set out to destroy the world. They fell in love. The women didn't intend to bear monsters. They bore children. The Nephilim didn't choose to be threats. They were born that way. Everyone acted from understandable motives: desire, love, ambition, curiosity. Yet the cumulative result was catastrophe. This pattern appears throughout human history. Well-intentioned actions produce unintended consequences. Technologies developed for good purposes enable unforeseen harms. Social changes that seem beneficial create problems that emerge only generations later. The road to hell, as the saying goes, is paved with good intentions. The Watcher narrative encodes this wisdom. Intentions don't determine outcomes. The Watchers intended to share knowledge, to raise families, to participate in human life. All of it seemed good. All of it led to destruction. Because the fundamental act crossing the heaven-earth boundary was wrong regardless of intent. Some boundaries exist not to frustrate desire, but to maintain the structure of existence itself. Jewish mysticism kept the Watcher narrative alive in ways mainstream rabbinic Judaism did not. The Merkabah texts from late antiquity describe mystics ascending through heavenly palaces, encountering named angels, learning secret knowledge. This is precisely the activity the Watcher narrative warns against. Humans seeking to cross the heaven-earth boundary from below, even as the Watchers crossed it from above. The Zohar, the central text of medieval Kabbalah compiled in 13th century Spain, incorporates Watcher traditions. It describes angelic princes ruling over nations, demonic powers opposing divine will, an ongoing cosmic warfare between forces of purity and contamination. The mixed offspring of Watchers and humans become, in Zohar's elaboration, the origin of demonic powers that tempt and test humanity. This Kabbalistic development transformed the Watcher narrative from ancient history into present reality. The boundaries weren't just crossed once in the distant past. They remain contested. Angels and demons, holy and impure, heavenly and earthly, these categories interpenetrate constantly. The mystic's task is to maintain proper boundaries while navigating between them, to draw down divine power without becoming contaminated, to ascend through heavens without being trapped or destroyed. Christian mysticism developed parallel traditions. Medieval accounts of demonic temptation, particularly of monks and saints, echo the Watcher narrative. Demons appear as beautiful women, or as angels of light, offering knowledge, pleasure, or power. The temptation is to cross the boundary between human and supernatural, to accept what should be refused, to mix what should remain separate. The witch trials of the early modern period prosecuted boundary crossing. Witches were accused of sexual commerce with demons, of learning forbidden knowledge, of producing through their unions beings or powers that threatened Christian society. The language of the accusations directly echoed the Watcher narrative. Boundaries were being violated, forbidden knowledge was being taught, offspring of mixed unions threatened the community. That these accusations were false, that tens of thousands of innocent people were tortured and executed based on fantasies about demonic boundary crossing, demonstrates how dangerous the Watcher narrative's logic can become. Once you accept that certain boundaries are sacred, that crossing them merits death, that the consequences threaten everyone, then any accusation of boundary violation becomes lethal. And the narrative survived because the questions it addressed wouldn't go away. As long as humans encounter the other, whether supernatural, foreign, or simply strange, they must decide how to respond. accept, reject, maintain distance, allow intimacy. The stakes of these decisions feel cosmic precisely because they shape what community will become, what children will inherit, what future is possible. Modern science fiction and fantasy keep the Watcher narrative alive in new forms. Stories of aliens mating with humans, of artificial intelligences developing emotions, of cyborgs and transhumans, of genetic engineering creating new species. All of these explore the same territory. What happens when boundaries between kinds of being erode? Is the result evolution or abomination? Optimistic versions portray boundary crossing as humanity's destiny. We're meant to transcend biological limits, to merge with machines, to spread across the galaxy and mix with whatever we find there. Pessimistic versions portray it as hubris. We're violating natural limits, creating Frankensteinian monsters, heading for catastrophe through our arrogant boundary crossing. The Watcher narrative provides the pessimistic framework, but it acknowledges the attraction. The Watchers weren't foolish or ignorant. They saw something worth descending for. The women weren't deceived. They recognized the opportunity. The knowledge taught wasn't useless. It enabled civilization. The tragedy is that all of it, attraction, opportunity, knowledge, civilization, still led to destruction because the fundamental act was boundary violation. This is why the story refused to die. It names something true about human experience. Growth often requires boundary crossing, but boundary crossing risks everything. Progress and catastrophe can be two aspects of the same development. What seemed like blessing can be revealed as curse, and by the time you realize what you've done, it may be too late to reverse. The story survives because the dilemma it poses remains unresolved. Should we cross boundaries between human and machine, biological and artificial, earthly and extraterrestrial? Should we pursue knowledge regardless of consequences? Should we accept the other, mate with the stranger, allow mixing and change? Or should we, like the survivors of the flood, maintain strict boundaries, reject contamination, preserve what we are against all pressure to become something else? The Watcher narrative doesn't answer these questions. It dramatizes them, shows their stakes, traces their consequences. It says, this has happened before. These are the patterns. Decide for yourselves, but decide knowing that everything, literally everything, may depend on whether you get it right. The academic study of 1 Enoch and related Watcher traditions exploded after the Dead Sea Scrolls proved these were not marginal texts but central documents of Second Temple Judaism. Several scholarly developments have reshaped understanding of the narrative and its significance. Reframing Second Temple Judaism. Scholars now recognize that the Judaism of 200 BCE to 100 CE was far more diverse than previously thought. Rather than a single normative Judaism with marginal deviations, there were multiple competing Judaisms: Pharisaic, Sadducean, Essene, apocalyptic, Hellenistic, diaspora. Each had different canons, different beliefs about angels and afterlife, different expectations about God's future actions. The Watcher tradition was normative for some of these groups, even if it later became marginal in Rabbinic Judaism and mainstream Christianity. Understanding Christian origins. Early Christianity emerged from apocalyptic Judaism, not from Pharisaic or proto-Rabbinic Judaism. Jesus' language about the kingdom of God, judgment, demons, and cosmic transformation makes most sense against the background of texts like St. Enoch. Scholars like George Nicholsberg, James Vanderkam, and Lauren Stuckenbrook have shown how thoroughly New Testament theology depends on Enochic traditions. The letters of Paul, the Gospels, Revelation all assume cosmological frameworks developed in Enochic literature, recognizing literary sophistication. Early scholarly treatment of 1 Enoch and similar texts dismissed them as primitive, confused, or simply weird. Contemporary scholars recognize sophisticated literary artistry, deliberate intertextuality with earlier scriptures and careful theological reasoning. The Book of the Watchers, far from being naive mythology, is a complex narrative that reworks Genesis 1:11, integrates Mesopotamian traditions, and addresses pressing political and theological questions facing Jews in the Hellenistic period, tracing cultural transmission. The Watcher narrative didn't stay confined to Judaism. It influenced Christianity, as noted, but it also appeared in Islamic traditions, the Harut and Marut story. In Manichaean dualism, the Book of Giants became part of Manichaean scripture, and in Vedic Gnostic system. Tracking these transmissions reveals how religious ideas travel, adapt, and transform across cultural boundaries. Connecting myth and history. Scholars no longer assume the Watcher narrative is pure fiction. While no one believes angels literally mated with humans, researchers recognize that myths also often preserve historical memories in transformed form. The narrative may encode memories of cultural contact between different populations, introduction of new technologies, social upheaval caused by foreign conquerors, tensions between priestly elites and common people, or generalized anxiety about change and loss of traditional ways. Nicolsburg's commentary on Verse Enoch, published in 2 volumes, 2001 and 2011, provides detailed historical critical analysis, tracing how the narrative drew on Mesopotamian Apkallu traditions, reinterpreted Genesis chapter 6:1-4, and addressed specific crises in Hellenistic Judea. His work shows that the text authors weren't primitive mythmakers, but sophisticated intellectuals engaging critically with their religious heritage and contemporary situation. Van der Kam's work on Enochic Judaism demonstrates that some Second Temple Jewish groups considered Enoch, not Moses, the most important figure in their tradition. For these groups, the Torah given at Sinai was less authoritative than the heavenly secrets revealed to Enoch. This Enochic Judaism was eventually suppressed by proto-rabbinic movements that emphasized Mosaic Torah, but it shaped early Christianity and may represent the matrix from which the Jesus movement emerged. Stuckenbrook's research on the Enochic demonology shows how the Watcher tradition provided Second Temple Judaism with explanatory power for the problem of evil. If evil originated from outside humanity, from rebellious angels and their demonic offspring, then God's creation remained good, human nature wasn't inherently corrupt, and evil could be definitively defeated by destroying the demons. This theodicy shaped how Jews and Christians thought about suffering, temptation, and divine justice. Archaeological work continues to illuminate the world that produced the Watcher traditions. Excavations at Qumran have revealed the community's ritual baths, scriptoria where scrolls were copied, communal dining halls and pottery workshops. The site's location, in the wilderness near the Dead Sea away from Jerusalem, reflects the community's self-understanding as exiles, as the righteous remnant maintaining purity while the rest of the nation fell into corruption. Comparative mythology has shown parallels between the Watcher narrative and traditions worldwide. The Greek Gigantes, the Norse Jotnar, the Hindu Asuras, the Polynesian demigod traditions. Many cultures have stories about boundary crossing between divine and human realms, producing powerful hybrid offspring. This suggests the narrative addresses universal human concerns about otherness, mixing, and the consequences of transgressing fundamental boundaries. Feminist scholars have critiqued the Watcher tradition for its treatment of women. The daughters of men are objects of desire, not subjects with agency. They bear monstrous offspring but have no voice in the texts. Later interpretations blame them for seducing angels, though the earliest versions make clear the Watchers initiated the unions. The tradition has been used historically to police women's sexuality, to blame women for male lust, to justify patriarchal control over marriage and reproduction. Yet some feminist scholars also note complexity in the tradition. The women's beauty is celebrated, not condemned. The text doesn't say they were raped. They were taken as wives. suggesting recognized relationships. The catastrophe isn't blamed primarily on them, but on the Watchers who violated cosmic law. Reading carefully, the tradition can be understood as condemning powerful beings who exploit their advantage over vulnerable others, a message applicable to patriarchal structures. Post-colonial scholars have examined how the Watcher tradition encodes anxieties about empire and cultural domination. The Watchers, descending from heaven, parallel foreign conquerors imposing themselves on subject populations. The forbidden knowledge they teach parallels the cultural and technological changes empire brings. The corruption of the earth parallels the social disruption colonization causes. Read this way, the tradition is less about supernatural events than about the experience of being colonized, of having boundaries violated by powerful outsiders, of having a familiar world transformed into something strange and threatening. The narrative's ultimate message, only total destruction and divine reset can restore proper order, has troubling implications. It suggests that once corruption occurs, gradual reform is impossible. Only apocalyptic intervention works. This can feed fatalism, passivity, or violent revolutionary movements that seek to hasten the catastrophe in hopes of what comes after. Yet the narrative also preserves hope. After the flood, the world begins again. Creation is restored. The boundaries are re-established. The righteous survive. This pattern, destruction followed by restoration, has sustained oppressed communities through centuries of persecution, offering hope that current suffering is not final, that cosmic justice will prevail, that the corrupt order will be swept away and replaced by something better. Contemporary scholarship thus recognizes the Watcher tradition as historically significant for understanding Second Temple Judaism and early Christianity, literarily sophisticated in its theological and narrative construction, culturally influential in ways that extend far beyond its original context, psychologically profound in addressing human anxieties about otherness, change, and boundary violation, and politically potent in both oppressive and liberatory ways depending on how it's deployed. The Academy's rediscovery of the Watcher tradition parallels broader cultural shifts. The 20th century saw catastrophic boundary violations, world wars, genocide, nuclear weapons, environmental destruction, that made ancient warnings about cosmic contamination feel newly relevant. The 21st century faces boundary questions the ancients couldn't imagine: genetic engineering, artificial intelligence, potential contact with extraterrestrial intelligence, but that fit the Watcher narrative's essential pattern. What happens when we cross boundaries between kinds of being? The story refused to die because scholarship kept it alive, showing it was neither primitive superstition nor marginal mythology, but a sophisticated tradition addressing questions that never stop being asked. Modern genetics finds no evidence of non-human ancestry in the human genome. Humans share 98.8% of our DNA with chimpanzees, 90% with cats, 60% with fruit flies, and even 50% with bananas, but we share all of this with every other human. There are no genetic markers suggesting some humans carry angelic or otherwise non-terrestrial DNA. Yet the Watcher tradition's central claim that unusual human characteristics derive from non-human ancestry reflects observations that genetics now explains differently. Extreme human variation exists. Height ranges from under 3 feet in cases of dwarfism to over 8 feet in cases of gigantism. Strength, intelligence, disease resistance, aging rate, and numerous other traits that show bell curve distributions with outliers far from the mean. Ancient peoples observing these outliers, an 8-foot-tall man, a child prodigy, someone with uncanny strength or beauty, had to explain them somehow. Genetics explains through mutation, recombination, and environmental factors. Ancient explanation required different categories: divine intervention, demonic influence, mixed ancestry, or curse blessing. The medical conditions that produce extreme height were unknown in antiquity but are well documented now. Gigantism results from excess growth hormone, usually from a pituitary tumour, occurring before growth plates close. Affected individuals can reach heights of 7 to 8 feet or more. Robert Wadlow, 1918 to 1940, the tallest reliably measured human, reached 8 feet 11 inches due to hyperplasia of his pituitary gland. Andre the Giant, 1946 to 93, the professional wrestler, stood 7 feet 4 inches due to acromegaly. These are not descendants of watchers, but individuals with identifiable medical conditions. Marfan syndrome, a genetic disorder affecting connective tissue, produces unusually tall individuals with long limbs and fingers. Historical figures possibly affected include Abraham Lincoln, though this remains debated. The condition causes distinctive body proportions that might, in antiquity, have seemed to mark affected individuals as different in kind, rather than degree from normal humans. Acromegaly, similar to gigantism but occurring after growth plates close, causes bone thickening and organ enlargement. Affected individuals develop distinctive facial features, protruding jaw, enlarged brow ridges, that give them an unusual, sometimes intimidating appearance. Without modern medical understanding, ancient peoples would have interpreted these conditions as evidence of non-human ancestry or divine demonic influence. A family line showing unusual height across generations, as can happen with heritable connective tissue disorders or populations adapted to specific environments, might be remembered as descended from giants, which might be remembered as descended from Nephilim, which descended from Watchers' dolls. The Tutsi people of Rwanda and Burundi average about 6 inches taller than neighbouring Hutu populations. Dutch populations average significantly taller than other Europeans. Dinkas from South Sudan include some of the world's tallest populations. These differences reflect complex genetic and environmental factors, but to ancient observers encountering such populations, the height difference might seem to require explanation through separate ancestry or divine influence. Similarly, exceptional cognitive ability, the child who learns to read years before peers, who displays mathematical gifts, who seems to grasp concepts others struggle with, has genetic and environmental components we're only beginning to understand. Ancient peoples observing such individuals might attribute their abilities to divine blessing, demonic possession, or mixed ancestry from beings with access to special knowledge. Anthropological research reveals that beliefs in hybrid ancestry serving to explain exceptional individuals are nearly universal. Every culture has categories for people who exceed normal limits: shamans with spirit world access, heroes with supernatural strength, kings with divine right, sorcerers with forbidden knowledge. The specific explanation varies, but the pattern repeats. Exceptionalness requires special origin. The Watcher narrative fits this pattern while adding specificity. The special origin is mixture with beings from the realm above the sky. This explains not just individual exceptional people, but the existence of knowledge and technologies that seem beyond normal human discovery. Metallurgy, astronomy, writing, mathematics, medicine. Someone taught these things, if not humans. Then who? Answer: the Watchers, beings with access to heavenly knowledge who descended and shared it. Modern anthropology explains technological development through gradual accumulation of discoveries, with occasional leaps when earlier developments combine in new ways. But this explanation wasn't available to ancients, who experienced technological change as mysterious. Why did some societies discover bronze working while others remained in the Stone Age? Why did writing emerge in some places and not others? Why did agriculture develop independently in multiple regions at roughly the same time in the Neolithic period? Without evolutionary or diffusionist frameworks, ancient explanations required external agents, gods teaching skills, culture heroes bringing fire from heaven, or fallen angels sharing forbidden knowledge. The Watcher narrative provided one such explanation, embedding it in a warning. Technologies from outside can be dangerous even when beneficial. This warning resonates in modern debates about technology. Nuclear weapons, genetic engineering, artificial intelligence, synthetic biology, each represents knowledge that some argue humans shouldn't possess, that we're not wise enough to manage safely, that may lead to our destruction. The Watcher narrative's essential message, forbidden knowledge brings catastrophe, remains a live concern even when we no longer attribute knowledge to fallen angels. Evolutionary psychology suggests humans have cognitive biases that made the Watcher narrative plausible to ancient audiences and keep similar narratives alive today. Hyperactive agency detection. Humans tend to see intentional agents behind events, especially threatening or unexplained events. Thunder isn't just atmospheric electricity, it's Thor's hammer. Disease isn't just microbial infection, it's divine punishment or demonic attack. This bias would make attributing human characteristics to angelic ancestry psychologically natural. Essentialist thinking. Humans tend to believe that category membership reflects deep essence, not just surface similarity. A dog is essentially a dog, not just an animal that looks and acts dog-like. Applied to people, essentialism suggests that exceptional individuals are essentially different, not just statistically extreme. Mixed ancestry with non-human beings provides essentialist explanation for essential difference. Contamination psychology. Humans feel disgust at mixing pure things with impure things, even when no harm results. A drop of sewage in pure water renders the whole contaminated. Removing the drop doesn't restore purity. Applied to lineages, this psychology creates horror at mixed ancestry even when specific harm is unidentifiable. These cognitive biases, shaped by evolutionary pressures to detect threats and maintain group boundaries, made the Watcher narrative psychologically compelling. It triggered multiple deep-seated intuitions, agency behind unusual events, essential difference explaining exceptionalism, contamination, explaining corruption. Modern science rejects the narrative's literal truth while acknowledging the observations it tried to explain. Exceptional humans exist. Technological knowledge transforms societies in ways that can seem magical to those without it. Mixing populations produces offspring with characteristics different from either parent population. These observations are real. The explanation, angelic ancestry, forbidden knowledge from heaven, hybrid offspring who threaten creation, is mythology. Yet mythology often preserves truths that science explains differently. The Watcher narrative preserved the observation that rapid technological change can be destabilizing, that mixing very different populations creates social tensions, that exceptional individuals often inspire both admiration and fear, that knowledge without wisdom is dangerous, that boundaries serve functions even when they seem arbitrary. Science provides better explanations for the observations, but doesn't necessarily provide better guidance for living with them. Knowing that gigantism results from pituitary tumours doesn't tell us how to treat unusually tall people socially. Understanding that intelligence has genetic and environmental components doesn't resolve debates about meritocracy and equality. Recognizing that all humans share recent common ancestry doesn't eliminate ethnic and racial tensions. The Watcher narrative, whatever its factual inadequacy, at least attempted to address the social and ethical dimensions of human variation, technological change, and cultural mixing. Modern science describes these phenomena precisely, but often avoids prescriptive conclusions. We know how variation arises, but not whether to celebrate or manage it. We understand technological development, but not whether to accelerate or restrain it. We recognize that populations differ, but not how to balance respect for differences with commitment to common humanity. The legendary narrative preserved questions even when its answers were wrong. Science provides better answers to how questions. How did humans become so variable? How did technology develop? How do populations mix and change? But the should questions remain. Should we embrace all variation? Should we pursue all knowledge? Should we remove all boundaries? These normative questions, which the Watcher narrative addressed directly, are not solved by scientific understanding of mechanisms. This is why the legend survives in science fiction and bioethics debates. Stories about human-alien hybrids, genetically engineered superhumans, or cyborgs merging human and machine echo the Watcher narrative's concerns. They ask, when we cross boundaries between kinds of being, what becomes of us? Are we still human? Do we remain within creation's design, or have we transgressed into territory where catastrophe awaits? Science says we're always still human, always within nature because nothing is outside nature. But the legend insists that some boundaries once crossed change everything. The flood may not come, but something equivalent, extinction, transformation into something we wouldn't recognize as ourselves, might. Science faces the legend not by disproving it. You can't disprove a category mistake, but by offering alternative frameworks for understanding the phenomena it addressed. Yet the legend persists because those phenomena remain troubling, and science's ethically neutral descriptions don't satisfy the human need for normative guidance about what to do when boundaries become crossable. Strip away supernatural elements, remove culturally specific details, extract the essential claim. The Watcher narrative says that boundaries are real, that crossing them has consequences, that what seems desirable or productive short-term can be catastrophic long-term, and that maintaining distinctions between heaven and earth, divine and human, inside and outside, pure and impure, is necessary for ordered existence. This claim is debatable. Modernity largely rejects it, arguing that boundaries are social constructions, that crossing them enables progress, that mixing produces hybrid vigor, that purity is neither possible nor desirable. Cosmopolitanism, multiculturalism, transhumanism, and globalization all assume boundary crossing as good or at least inevitable. But the ancient claim remains worth considering. Perhaps boundaries are real, not in the sense of being natural or divinely mandated, but in the sense of being functional constraints that enable certain kinds of order. Cross them and you don't necessarily violate moral law, but you do change what's possible and what remains stable. Consider language boundaries. Each language carves up reality differently, enables different concepts, carries different cultural knowledge. When languages mix, creoles and pidgins emerge, simplified hybrid languages that enable communication but initially lack the complexity of their parent languages. Over generations they can develop into full complexity, but something is lost in the transition. The specific ways each parent language structured thought disappear or merge. New possibilities emerge, but old ones vanish. Or consider ecosystem boundaries. Each ecosystem represents a stable configuration of species, energy flows, and nutrient cycles. Introduce a species from outside and the ecosystem shifts, often catastrophically. Zebra mussels in the Great Lakes, cane toads in Australia, kudzu in the American Hemisphere. These boundary crossings produced invasive species that devastated existing ecological relationships. The ecosystems didn't cease to exist, but they transformed into something degraded from what they had been. Or consider the boundaries between artificial and natural, engineered and evolved. CRISPR technology enables editing genomes with precision impossible in nature. This crosses a boundary, not a moral boundary necessarily, but a functional one between mutation rates possible through natural variation and those possible through intentional design. The consequences remain uncertain. We may cure genetic diseases. We may also create organisms whose interactions with existing life produce unforeseen cascades of effects. The Watcher narrative insists these are not neutral technical changes, but boundary violations with cosmic significance. Modern thought dismisses this as superstition, but the narrative might be communicating something difficult to express in purely technical language. Some changes alter systems so fundamentally that the system itself becomes different in kind, not just in degree. When angels married humans, the change wasn't just statistical, a bit more height, a bit more knowledge in the population. It was categorical. Beings appeared whose nature was ontologically different, whose existence destabilized creation itself. The flood wasn't punishment for violating arbitrary rules, but necessary reset because the system had been pushed past the point where gradual correction was possible. This maps onto modern concerns about technological change. Artificial general intelligence, if developed, wouldn't be just another tool but a categorically different kind of entity whose existence would change everything about how human civilization functions. Climate change isn't just weather variation, but potential shift to a planetary state that cannot support current civilization. Nuclear war wouldn't just kill many people, but potentially end the conditions that enable complex society. These are threshold phenomena, changes that once they cross certain points, can't be gradually reversed. The Watcher narrative encoded understanding of threshold phenomena in mythological language. Boundaries exist, crossing them can reach points of no return, and at those points only catastrophic intervention, flood, or transformation, new creation, can establish new equilibrium. The emotional core of the narrative is grief. The Watchers fell in love. That's not villainous, it's humanizing. They became human in their desires even though doing so violated their nature. The women bore children. That's not evil, it's natural. The Nephilim were powerful, impressive beings. But all of it had to be destroyed because the boundary violation, however understandable, however productive of remarkable beings, destabilized existence itself. This suggests the ancient authors understood something moderns struggle with. Good intentions and desirable results don't guarantee that an action is wise. The consequences of actions extend beyond immediate results to systemic effects that may take generations to manifest. By the time the catastrophe is apparent, reversal may be impossible. The narrative also encodes understanding that corruption spreads. The Watchers taught knowledge to their wives and children. Those taught others. Forbidden knowledge diffused through the population. Metallurgy enabled better tools but also better weapons. Astrology enabled calendar calculation, but also claims to foreknowledge that disrupted traditional authority. Cosmetics enabled beauty enhancement but also class marker manipulation that destabilized social hierarchies. Each individual piece of knowledge wasn't necessarily evil, but the cumulative effect was corruption, breakdown of the boundaries, categories, and hierarchies that had structured society. The antediluvian world became chaotic not through simple moral failure, but through systematic boundary erosion. Too many kinds of knowledge in too many hands, too many mixed beings with ambiguous status. Too many violations of what had been solid categories. Modern society experiences similar erosion. Class boundaries that once seemed solid blur as education and entrepreneurship enable mobility. Gender categories that once seemed binary are revealed as more complex. National boundaries that once structured politics and identity become permeable through migration and digital connectivity. Each boundary's erosion has constituencies celebrating it as liberation and constituencies mourning it as corruption. The Watcher narrative sides with the mourners. Boundary erosion is corruption, mixing is contamination, change is degradation. This conservative stance is unfashionable now. But the narrative forces consideration of what's lost when boundaries disappear. If everything can be anything, if all categories are fluid, if no boundaries are respected, what remains stable enough to provide orientation? How do we know what we are if we can be anything? The flood is the answer. When corruption becomes total, when boundaries are so thoroughly eroded that the system collapses, only reset works. Destroy everything, start over, re-establish the boundaries, and this time maintain them. This apocalyptic conclusion is the narrative's most troubling aspect. It suggests that gradual reform is impossible once corruption passes a threshold. It validates revolutionary rather than evolutionary change. It promises that the corrupt order will be violently swept away and replaced by something pure. Such thinking has motivated both liberatory and oppressive movements. Oppressed groups embrace it as hope. The current corrupt order will fall and God will establish justice. Oppressors embrace it as license. The corruption is so total that violent purging is justified. But the narrative itself doesn't celebrate the flood. God grieves over the decision to destroy creation. Noah and his family survive, but in a traumatized, diminished world, the giants are destroyed, but so is everything beautiful and good about the antediluvian world. The cost of reset is nearly total loss. Perhaps this is the ultimate message. Maintain boundaries not because crossing them is morally wrong, but because the alternative, letting erosion continue until reset becomes necessary, is catastrophically costly. Better to accept constraints, to resist attractive boundary crossings, to maintain distinctions even when they seem arbitrary, than to pursue every possibility until the system breaks and can only be restored through destruction of nearly everything. This is the ancient wisdom encoded in the story of angels who married humans. Some loves, however genuine, lead to catastrophe. Some knowledge, however valuable, corrupts. Some mixing, however productive of remarkable beings, destabilize existence. Not because the gods are arbitrary, but because creation has a structure. Boundaries are part of that structure, and respecting them is the price of inhabiting an ordered cosmos rather than chaos. Whether this wisdom applies to modern questions about genetic engineering, artificial intelligence, cultural globalization, and technological transformation remains debatable. But the questions themselves, should we cross these boundaries? What are the consequences if we do? At what point does cumulative change destabilize the entire system? These questions the ancients posed remain as urgent as ever. The shepherd boy who pressed his testimony into wet clay in 701 BCE knew something had descended, knew boundaries had been crossed, knew only that they walk with us, and feared what would follow. His fear, preserved across 3 millennia, asks whether we, facing our own boundary crossings, have wisdom to match our power, or whether we too walk toward a flood of our own making, unable to reverse course because the boundaries we needed to maintain were crossed long ago when the consequences still seemed distant and the attractions too powerful to resist.